Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, events, and more across our country, as well as across the surface of our divided globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. First up, I just want to give people a heads up. As far as I can tell, we're going to be off the air on Monday. So we're going to be, it's a federal holiday. Oh, no, we're not. You know what? I got my dates wrong. That's the thing. I was as bad. So we're going to be on the air on Monday. Let's just move on. Let's get into the headlines here. First up, in COVID news, let's get into it. For the fourth straight day, you've had less than 100,000 new cases reported in the United States yesterday, at least 3,252 new coronavirus deaths. Over the past week, there has been an average of 104,554 cases per day. That's a decrease of 36% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Thursday morning, more than 27,328,400 people in the U.S. have been infected with the coronavirus, and over 471,000 have died from it. Andrew Cuomo's administration, Governor of New York's administration, has set up 19 COVID-only nursing homes throughout the state to treat recovering patients who are discharged from hospitals. State Health Commissioner Howard Zucker revealed the establishment of the coronavirus-only nursing homes in a 16-page letter sent to the state legislature Wednesday, which was his response to a series of questions submitted by lawmakers who chair committees overseeing nursing homes. Governor Andrew Cuomo and his health department came under fierce criticism last spring during the worst of the COVID-19 outbreak, when thousands of recovering coronavirus patients were released from hospitals and sent to nursing homes. Some nursing home operators claimed a March 25th state health department directive pressured them to admit or readmit COVID-19 patients at a time when they were already overwhelmed by the outbreak. At the time, nursing homes were not allowed to test new admissions for COVID-19, had inadequate personal protective equipment, and suffered from staffing shortages. And this is, again, the legacy of Andrew Cuomo's bad leadership. Wouldn't you say, Jamarl?
Absolutely. We talk about it all the time on the show. We hit Cuomo constantly in a way that other people don't bring it up. And so, that's exactly what it is. Agreed.
Well, and there's a reason for that. I mean, he was the guy who was, I want to move on to other news, but he was the guy who was sort of front and center for the Democrats in his COVID response last year as a kind of political rebuttal to what Trump was doing. And he didn't handle it well either. Anyway, over in Los Angeles, Mayor Eric Garcetti said the city's 5 city-run vaccination sites, including Dodger Stadium, will close on Friday and Saturday due to a lack of doses. The city will have exhausted its current supply of the Moderna vaccine for first dose appointments by Thursday, forcing the temporary closures. The city had administered 293,000 doses so far at its 5 vaccination sites, a 27% distribution increase since last week, and is averaging about 13,000 doses a day. Dodger Stadium, one of the largest mass vaccination sites in the country, has the capacity to inoculate up to 12,000 people a day. The city, however, only received 16,000 new doses this week, down from 90,000 the week before and 29,000 from the week before that. So vaccine distribution is sort of uneven across the country. And it's not just in terms of space. Different cities are getting different amounts, and, rural environments are getting different amounts than cities, of course. You're also getting it in time, where, like you can see, 29,000 received 1 week, 90,000 the next, and 16,000 the week after that. I just want to throw my brief take in on this one. In my opinion, it is good for them to give more doses out sooner, but it confuses people if you have an apparently open vaccine program that nevertheless fairly quickly gets shut down because they run out of vaccines. I mean, it's good to get them out sooner, but if you expect to be able to go in and get a vaccine and suddenly you can't because they're running a shortage, that doesn't feel good. That's sort of disconcerting for the public, I'm sure. Anyway, the United States will turn away most migrants apprehended at its border with Mexico under a Trump-era policy. That's according to White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki yesterday, adding that the move would limit the spread of the COVID pandemic and also give the new administration ample time to implement new immigration policies. Although President Joe Biden vowed to undo Trump's border rules, he has still in place a provision called Title 42, which allows American authorities to rapidly expel people crossing the U.S.-Mexico borders. A number of migrant families with children and unaccompanied minors apprehended by U.S. agents along the southern border increased last month. Out of 78,000 arrests in January, nearly 65,000 involved single adults. Customs and Border Protection reported detaining nearly 5,900 unaccompanied minors and making 7,500 apprehensions of parents and children traveling together in January. In December, U.S. officials made fewer than 4,700 apprehensions of families and nearly 5,000 of unaccompanied children. In national political news, House impeachment managers will today finish arguing their case that former President Donald Trump incited an insurrection one day after they showed violent and disturbing video footage of the attack on the U.S. Capitol as they urged senators to convict at the Senate trial. That footage, by the way, at least some of it came from Jordan Sheridan, as far as I can tell. You're talking about this, Jamal, whose video on this, whose account in general, please correct me if I'm wrong, Jamal, has been taken down based on recording footage. At least the video was taken down. Jamal, what's the details on this?
Yeah, so that's pretty wild. Yeah, you got the details pretty much right. So Jordan was working with another journalist that was basically taking the footage, and it was played on Status Quo. Now, they took that video down, YouTube did, saying that video was inappropriate in some particular way, and yet, in Congress, it was appropriate for them to show in their condemnation of Donald Trump to try to impeach. Isn't that amazing? That a video that YouTube said is inappropriate is the exact video that they're showing to detail the reality of events at the Capitol. What's wrong with this picture? There's something dramatically wrong with this, right? If it's good for Congress, why is it not good for YouTube? If they can use that as condemnation of Trump, why is that not good enough for YouTube? So yeah, that's astonishing, but that's true. That's exactly what happened.
It is. It's bizarre. Never before seen Capitol security camera footage, meanwhile, forced senators to relive the harrowing attack and confront chilling new details about the incredibly serious threat posed to everyone in the Capitol, including lawmakers. A number of GOP senators made clear Wednesday evening that they were shaken by what they saw, but still signaled they won't change how they plan to vote as Trump appears headed toward acquittal at the conclusion of the trial. There simply aren't enough Republicans willing to turn on Trump, to turn on the president of their party, former president of their party, in order to impeach him. So, very likely it's not going to happen. And this is, we got into this briefly yesterday with Garland, but this is something I've been meaning to bring up for a while. I'm against the impeachment in this case. I think it's ridiculous. I don't think that Trump, I understand why people would feel that he deserves to be impeached, but if you actually look at what he said, I don't think that counts as incitement. But nevertheless, what you have is a system that wouldn't impeach regardless. Say he did say something that were worthy of it. I'm not sure if enough Republicans would change their minds in that event to actually do it. It seems like we have an increasingly politically divided system where each party is trying to obstruct the other in critical, in the key ways. And the whole thing, at the same time, they both fundamentally serve so many of the same economic and military interests that it's the worst of both worlds. You have them agreeing on the things on which they shouldn't and disagreeing on the things on which they should. Anyway, in other national political news, a man fatally shot himself in front of the home of Texas Congresswoman Republican Representative Beth Van Duyns on Wednesday afternoon, shortly before 4 p.m. When police officers arrived, they found the victim lying on the sidewalk with a gunshot wound. The victim's identity has not been released. Van Duyns, the former mayor of Irving, Texas, who was recently elected to serve in the House, was home during the shooting. The congresswoman called the police after hearing a gunshot and seeing a body in front of her walkway. In international political news, Pakistan's military on Thursday successfully test-fired a short-range surface-to-surface ballistic missile capable of hitting land and sea targets with high precision, quote-unquote, up to 490 kilometers, about 280 miles away. In a statement, it said the Babur cruise missile was, quote, launched from a state-of-the-art multi-tube missile launch vehicle, end quote. According to the statement, Pakistan's President Arif Alvi, Prime Minister Imran Khan, and the country's military leadership congratulated scientists and engineers over the successful launch of the missile. Pakistan's nuclear and missile program is primarily aimed at countering threats from neighboring India, which also routinely conducts missile tests. Both nations have nuclear arms and have fought 2 of their 3 wars over Kashmir since gaining independence from Britain in 1947. The disputed Himalayan region is split between them and claimed by both. 3 Turkish soldiers were killed in a new Turkish military offensive against a Kurdish militant in northern Iraq, Turkey's defense ministry said Thursday. 2 of these soldiers were killed Wednesday in a clash that erupted in northern Iraq's Gara region on the first day of the latest Turkish operation. Another soldier died of his wounds on Thursday. Iran, the country Iran, has started producing uranium metal despite being warned by world powers that it constitutes another breach of the 2015 nuclear deal, which, hey, by the way, the U.S. has backed out on. So I'm not, that's a little bit more fraught. We were the main 2 parties. We were the main ones sanctioning Iran. Since we pulled out of that, they are, of course, backing out in their own ways, too. International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors verified the existence of 3.6 grams, that's about 0.1 ounces, of the substance at a facility in Isfahan last week. Iran says it is carrying out research and development with the aim of producing fuel in a research reactor and insists that its nuclear program is entirely peaceful. Iran's paramilitary Revolutionary Guard Thursday began a ground forces drill near the Iraqi border. The report said the annual exercise, dubbed the Great Prophet, is ongoing in the southwest of the country and has aimed at readiness and assessment of forces. Drones and helicopters will be used in the drill, too. Tokyo's 2020 Olympics chief Yoshiro Mori will step down after sexist remarks he made about women were leaked to Japanese media last week. Japanese public broadcaster NHK reported on Thursday. Mori said it at an Olympics Board of Trustees meeting last week. The board meetings with lots of women take longer, that's a quote, because, quote, women are competitive. If one member raises their hand to speak, others might think they need to talk too, end quote, according to reports in the Japanese press. He also said, quote, if you want to increase female membership, you would be in trouble unless you put time limits in place, end quote. Speaking at a news conference the next day, the 83-year-old former Japanese prime minister confirmed he made the remarks behind closed doors and said he was sorry for doing so. In Myanmar, the country's military government has submitted 36 pages outlining proposed laws, basically giving the government the most extensive censorship rights I have seen to date that, various countries have seen to date. Although we have our own thing going on over here in the States, and frankly, internationally, we're doing our fair bit of censoring too. Nevertheless, this has come under pressure. It has been decried by Google, Twitter, and various human rights authorities and civil rights authorities internationally. Submitted this on Tuesday. In Earth and Science news, Nepal has banned 2 Indian climbers and their team leader for 6 years from mountaineering in the country after an investigation found they had faked their 2016 climb up Mount Everest. Their climb was certified by the tourism department at the time. The action against them came when they failed to produce any evidence after Mr. Yadav was nominated for an award. A Nepal tourism ministry official told AFP that during their investigations with other climbers, they found that the 2, quote, never reached the summit, end quote, and had failed to produce any reliable pictures of the summit or other evidence. In business news, global energy company Shell said it plans to eliminate 7 refineries and reduce production of gasoline and diesel fuel by 55% over the next decade as it unveiled new plans for reaching its goal of being carbon neutral by 2050. Royal Dutch Shell, which built its brand exploring for oil and natural gas in Africa, South America, and the North Sea, said Thursday that the company's oil production peaked in 2019 and is expected to decline by 1% to 2% annually. The company plans to increase its network of electric vehicle charging stations to about 500,000 by 2025 from 60,000 today and double electricity sales to retail and business customers. Shell also said it would invest $100 million annually in nature-based solutions that protect or redevelop forests, wetlands, and grasslands that take carbon out of the atmosphere. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break. When we come back, we will be in our soapbox segment, and tomorrow we'll be talking about Neeratanid. We're going to be getting into a conversation towards the end of that. Neeratanid versus Republicans and Sanders versus the left and the right. Back on that in just a minute.
Fault Lines. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Are you bored? very lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. You can also send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your participation and engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. I'm going to call it an audible. Value, as I said before, is never an absolute thing. And so, frankly, if we lived in a functional government, Trump would be impeached, and the issues pertaining to this stuff will be of great significance, and it is. I'm not underplaying it. It's the news show, and even Sanders going after Neera Tanden is funny, it's comical. She deserves all of it. She is a cantankerous woman, but she got confirmed. So I want to call an audible, and I want to get to something that is of great, great significance and a pressing urgency, especially to me and people like me, geeks all over the world. Josh Whedon, apparently, is an abusive god. Josh Whedon, the creator of Buffy, the creator of Angel. There's another space thing that he ended up in. He was also in Justice League.
Firefly.
That's it, Firefly, thank you. Cowboys in space. Perfect. And on top of that, and less that I want to even bring up, is Star Wars. I'm sorry, Justice League. More interesting was another movie he did with a cabin in the woods that was one of the awesomest sci-fi horror films that came out.
Yes.
With his own flair.
Fantastic.
Yes, with his own flair. And so it pains me. You have no idea how much it pained me to read Cordelia Chase talk about the abuse she suffered at the hands of Josh Whedon. And it wasn't just her. She came out saying, I stand with Fisher, when Fisher brought up the attacks. More interesting than not, she talks about the attacks on her pregnancy. She had told him calling her fat, him asking her whether she's going to keep the baby, other attacks, bringing her in at like 1 a.m. after her doctor talks about illness, threats to fire her constantly throughout the course of the show. Buffy even comes out backing her up. Buffy makes the point that says, I love and associate my work with Buffy the Vampire Slayer. However, I do not want my name associated with Wheaton. Buffy's sister comes out, talks about she's brave enough as a 35-year-old woman to report this because it must be known as a teenager, which was not appropriate. His behavior was not appropriate. He has been condemned all around. Josh Whedon has been an abusive god. This is difficult for me. And you're going to think that this is probably one of the most misogynistic defenses, even though it's not a defense, it's going to sound that way. And you're probably going to think very bad things about me, but I would say listen to the argument all the way through because it is a difficult argument for me to make. And yes, damn it, I'm going to make it. What if it was necessary for those performances in Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel, shows that are remarkable? What if it was necessary for him to be that guy? What if it took a brutish god to get the performances out of those characters? Now, I'm not saying it's justified. I'm just asking the question. When I play chess, I stuck to it, like dedicated. It's hard to get across how much I love that game. My mom didn't have to push me on that game, and ended up, once I got ill, that became my life. That board was my escape. That illness was, in a sense, my taskmaster that kept me and my focus on that board to ignore all of the pain, all of the surgeries, all of the injuries, and all of this other stuff. The potential of death was put to the side because I could exist in that board. And I excelled, moving up to the point of rate 2032. That's near master level. And, by the way, from Blitz, I could take down masters. I beat masters on a U.S. Chess Federation in tournaments. I was a monster. What if the illness was necessary for me to be that monster? What if the illness was the taskmaster that was necessary to keep my focus on that game? And if it wasn't for that illness, perhaps I would have played, but maybe not to that degree. What about Serena Williams and their dad, Michael Jackson and his dad? What about the other kids that grow up with taskmaster parents that keep those kids on pace? Even though at the time it looks brutal, it looks unfair, it looks wrong, and yet that kid becomes utterly and entirely remarkable. I will go further. Supernatural, a show that I loved, may not exist without the success of Buffy and Angel. The show where Buffy nearly gets raped by Spike. The show where it gets so dark, where Willow, this bubblegum person, becomes so dark, she's like vomiting snakes and black magic, ripping the skin off of people. This is a bubblegum show. It got so dark. It was awesome. An Angel spinoff, a vampire with a soul. And that vampire with a soul gets called a champion. Understand here. Yes, I'm a geek out because the show was phenomenal. Angel had gotten to the point where Josh Whedon had this thing where he would consider items that were cosmic. It wasn't somebody else calling it. It was cosmic. Elements of the cast. Buffy, she was a slayer on a cosmic level. Beings from outside of our reality space considers these people slayers, or in Angel's case, a champion. It wasn't something that somebody called him. It wasn't something that he just took on. Cosmic beings built into the fabric of the universe. They are there. That's their role. And Josh Whedon was able to come up with characters like this that were that phenomenal. If you look back at it now, it looks really bubblegum, but the shows were astonishing. When Angel ends up having a son, Angel couldn't save his son, and the son comes back multiple years after being in a hell dimension and says, "Why didn't you save me, Dad?" As he has all of these psychological issues associated with him growing up in that particular way. "Why couldn't you save me, Dad?" And Angel in tears, not able to give him an explanation, even though he did everything in his power to save that kid. Those performances were phenomenal. Supernatural, another show that I love, would not exist without Angel and without Buffy being extraordinary as those shows were. Dean going to hell. Sam drinking demon blood because he's trying to get his brother back. He's not dealing well. The shows are astonishing. What if, and again, this is not a defense, but a question. What if, in the same way that who I am today is intrinsically linked to the illness and the hardship and the near deaths and the pain and the surgeries and the needle sticks and all of this other stuff, what if that stuff was intrinsically necessary for me to be who I am and excel either at chess or, for the most part, doing the news? What about Michael Jackson, or what about Michael Jordan or Serena Williams? What if those fathers being rough was intrinsically necessary for them being who they are today? And what if the same thing was true for Buffy and for Angel? Think about the millions of people, just like me, who geek out at that stuff, who love that stuff, who lived in those shows. Millions. None of those people want Cordelia, or for that matter, Sarah Michelle Gellar, or for that matter, the cast, to be under any kind of pain or injury or anything like that. But, what if that was necessary to make the show what it was? We allow Amazon workers to break their backs in order to give us that ridiculous little steamer because you saw one in Portugal. And that worker with a little thing on his arm and with his union busting thing, we still order from Amazon. We know the pain that's involved in getting those products from A to B. We know the backbreaking work, and yet we order and order to the tune of nearly $1 trillion from Bezos. What about fast food workers who get paid little or nothing to give you horrible food and a horrible working environment? What about people who work at those animal shelters, or for that matter, the people who pick your fruit and whatnot? We know, we accept back-breaking labor. We accept horrible things for other people for the benefit of our taste buds or for the benefit of just something we want around the house. We accept those things. Those people are faceless. Those people are nameless. How is this different? Now, again, this is not a justification. This sounds, I understand it, radically misogynistic, toxically masculine. By the same token, what I'm saying is true. I am not saying that the individual cast members should have to put up with that at all. From my standpoint, from your standpoint, from your personal point of view, you should not have to deal with that. You should not have to deal with a toxic working environment. You should not have to deal with somebody browbeating, belaboring you, attacking your pregnancy. You shouldn't have to go any of that. From your point of view, totally I get it. And I totally back you on that. By the same token, those were phenomenal shows. And I do think it's a fair question to ask. Is it possible that without the Taskmaster, those shows would not have been as good? Or for that matter, those shows would have been lesser? What would the world be like if Supernatural didn't exist? And I can't fathom that reality. It's too much. While I say, I agree with you from your personal point of view that you should not have to deal with that, I am not going to take the coward's way out that many geeks will take if they were asked 3 a.m. between them and their God whether or not they think the abuse that they suffered balances out to the joy to millions. 3 a.m. between them and their God, they would say yes. And I'm going to say yes here. I'm going to take all sorts of hits for this. Yes. I am still saying it is not right that he did those things to you at all. It is from your point of view that is horrendous. But I'm not in your point of view. And while I hate the fact that he did those things, the outgoing product was phenomenal. And I'm unclear on whether or not the product at the end result would have been that way if he did not behave in the way that he behaved. Shane punched me in the face on this because this sounds radically misogynistic. And again, I'm not saying that it's justified. I can't make that argument. I can only make that argument from a point of view thing and say that, wow, it sucked, but the end result was awesome. And is it possible that the end result had a lot to do with the fact that he was a horrible, vengeful God? What do you think, Shane?
I haven't seen him, so I can't stand up on that side of the argument. I saw the stuff you were posting about this. I was looking at your feed, and that's how I found out about this, all these allegations against Joss Whedon. I'll briefly comment. I've seen the Avengers movie that he produced, and then the one actual sort of deeper experience that I had with Joss himself, which I watched part of Firefly. I watched some of Firefly, not the whole thing. I wasn't the hugest fan, but it was a good show. From a sort of limited vantage that I had. I mean, I could push back, and so maybe I will, which is you're making the utilitarian argument in some sense. More people benefited from the creation of these shows than the specific actors who suffered this abuse suffered. And so, therefore it works out. There are all sorts of different ways in which I could push back on that. And so for a moment, at least, just to give people a bit of entertainment, are you not entertained? I'll do so. You say that it's worth it, but those actresses, specifically Cordelia, have been deeply traumatized by this, where she says that during the course of the filming, based on how Joss Whedon was treating her, she picked up and has since suffered what has become a lifelong physical illness. It's become a lifelong physical illness. How many times would that have to happen for it to be worth the creation of that series? Or can't you make another argument, which is, okay, you're assuming that him abusing her during the course of the show benefited the show. But how do you know that? How do you know the show wouldn't have been better? And are we willing to justify abuse on a wide basis in our society if it makes some other elements of our society maybe better and we never actually know? Or shouldn't we just, as a rule, try to confront and counter abuse when we see it, wherever we find it? Isn't that, like, for a sane, healthy society, the way to do it? Can't you? I'll put it like this. I think of the director Werner Herzog, who, as far as I know, hasn't ever been accused of abuse. He's had some crazy relationships with his actors, where Klaus Kinski, an actor he worked with a lot, they would regularly be up in each other's face, yelling at each other. Klaus Kinski was kind of known as a madman in general, so maybe it's not his fault. In one of his movies, Fitzgeraldo, he actually had his staff and this is even more controversial, way more controversial. They constructed, the movie is about the creation of a boat in in South America and basically building a boat and carrying a boat over a mountain in the jungle to set it down in a river on the other side because the main character wants to build an opera in this country in South America. I believe it's Brazil. And they actually did that. And they worked with indigenous people local to the area to build the boat and to carry it over the mountain. And while they were doing it, these people didn't necessarily know 100% what they were doing. Some of the local people actually died. Now, Werner Herzog is still relatively widely revered as a sort of more alternative indie-leaning film director. Is that justified? Is that better? I don't know. I'm bringing up different examples here. But the point is he was able to get that done, and yet I haven't ever heard him called abusive. So it doesn't seem right to me. Anyway, we need to go into a break. Any quick take before we come back tomorrow?
I mean, I can't justify it. I can't. I mean, I agree with you. But I don't know what the alternate. I just know what happened. And what happened was a phenomenal show. And again, it's not that I think it's okay for people to be abusive. It's not, honestly. And that's not really the argument. It's more so it's asking the question of whether the end product justifies what took place in order to get that end product when that end product was phenomenal and was beautiful to millions. And if it's okay for us to do it for Amazon or fast food workers, why is it different for those? That's all. It's a brutal argument to make, but fair enough. I'll be the geek that would be honest on radio.
That's the brass tacks consequentialist, sort of more utilitarian argument to make. And there are all sorts of ways in which I could push back on that, but we should come back to that some other time because people make those kinds of arguments all the time in different ways in politics. And they're politically not popular. And so on the one hand, I'm inclined to actually agree with them because I don't like a lot of people shutting down smaller ideas or marginal ideas just because they don't like it, just because it doesn't appeal to them. But there are also significant problems with that approach. But we got to go into a break. We'll be coming back in just a minute, talking with George Samueli and Peter Lavelle about various recent events in Russia, the Sputnik V vaccine, winning the Washington Post confusing article on this, as well as Borrell's meeting, Josep Borrell's meeting with Russia's foreign minister, and how that was an absolute embarrassment for him. But we'll be back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Back in just a minute on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Great job. Even better. Let's get one more, just to be sure.
Are you a young photographer the world needs to know? Bring your images to more eyes through the Andrei Stenin contest. Open to both artists and photojournalists, there are dozens of categories to enter and compete for a share of serious prize money. And, more importantly, international recognition of your work. Learn more about how to enter at stenincontest.com. Point, shoot, win.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined by my host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Interesting things have been taken afoot, not just in the United States on the issue of impeachment, but also in the issue of foreign policy, especially with the new administration coming in. This brings us to the EU. Not just the EU, there's other commentary that has been taking place that we have to talk about, but the EU, for right now, to start off. Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell is facing criticism that he is not up to the job. Last April, Borrell called before the European Parliament to answer allegations that his office had watered down report on disinformation to appease China. Last month, the standing of the Turkish foreign minister in Brussels, Borrell failed to read out prepared remarks expressing concern about, quote, rule of law and human rights. Instead, he voiced concern, quote, about the situation in Turkey from any point of view. Now, this problem has gotten that much more acute in a recent event where Foreign Minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, basically ran circles around Borrell, and the EU is not happy about it. The Russian foreign minister basically accused the EU of lying about poisoning of Alexei Navalny and called the bloc, quote, an unreliable partner. This gets worse. Insult to injury, as Borrell learned from Twitter, yes, Twitter, during a working lunch in the news conference that Russia had expelled 3 EU diplomats from Germany, Sweden, and Poland. Borrell is facing calls for resignation, and is being, from 70 MPs, basically drafted a letter to Commission President Ursula von Leyen demanding his resignation or removal. Borrell was defending himself, basically saying that you guys are just mad that I took a trip to Russia in and of itself. That's not really the issue, though. The issue is he seems to be weak on the job. Joining us to discuss is Peter Lavelle, American journalist and host of Crosstalk on RT, and George Samueli, Senior Research Fellow at the Global Policy Institute and author, are together hosts of Peter Lavelle's The Gaggle, now airing on YouTube. Peter and George, what's going on, guys?
Go ahead, George.
Okay. Well, the problem was that Borrell...
Wait, I was just saying hi. I was just saying hi to both of you, that's all.
How are you?
I'm doing all right. But we can start with you. What's the issue with this, right? It seems that he got completely embarrassed from a foreign policy standpoint, or from let's say a foreign diplomat standpoint. And now he's calling for sanctions. What is wrong with this picture? And why is the EU pressing so much on him? Is he really that bad of a diplomat?
Well, he is bad as a diplomat because he went to Russia really without a specific agenda. And that's always a bad thing for a diplomat to do. And then he started berating his hosts about internal Russian matters. Namely the issue of Alexei Navalny. Now, Alexei Navalny has violated Russian laws. He has been given due process. People may not like it, but nonetheless, it's a matter of Russian internal affairs. And for Borrell to raise this issue was asking for trouble because, of course, the Russians responded and said, well, we look at the television and we see the way dissidents are treated in the European Union and the harshness with which the police treat them, and then the lengthy prison terms that they're subjected to. And particularly Lavrov brought up the issue of the referendum organizers in Catalonia and the hefty prison terms that they were subjected to. And then, of course, we've seen the violent dispersal of demonstrators against COVID restrictions. So Lavrov made these points. And then, again, in accordance with diplomatic protocol, in accordance with the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, the Russians expelled 3 EU diplomats who had taken part in the protests over Navalny. Now, that, of course, is a fundamental violation of, as I say, the Vienna Convention, because diplomats are representatives of foreign governments, and their job is clearly not to interfere in the internal affairs of the countries to which they are assigned. So for Borrell to start agitating about that, shows his own kind of ignorance of such a diplomatic protocol. And then he came along, having been shown up to be lacking depth in these matters. He wrote a very lengthy blog posting defending himself and said that, well, he was really tough with the Russians, he wants sanctions and so on. So these are not things that you're supposed to do if you want to be taken seriously as a diplomat. And so the upshot is that Borrell bungled his trip to Moscow, and he's kind of antagonized the various European politicians who want even harsher treatment of Russia, even though it doesn't actually achieve anything. I mean, the goal should be a good diplomatic relations between Europe and Russia, because there's plenty of things of common interest to discuss.
Well, let's jump in there for the moment.
Many Europeans want bad relations and want a conflict.
Let's go over there for the moment. Let's move to that particular topic. And Peter, I'm going to bring you in on this. It seemed that part of the issue was that they were embarrassed about Biden. that they were coming into a new administration, and that the United States would be looking at what took place. And they were basically bothered, in part, by the fact that he didn't seem to stand up and how that was going to look from the standpoint of America and from the American perspective. Peter, please expand on
I'm not really sure we can. I don't think we really can pull in the new Biden administration yet. There are different issues there. But I think that, taking a step back, and I completely agree with George, it's not just Borrell, it's the entire EU foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia. Let's not just look at the reaction to his bungling, which of course it was. I'm surprised he wasn't speaking 3 different languages at one time. He seems to have a habit of doing that. But look at the reaction within the European to him. It's all over the place. And they're just angry because their arrogance was shown for what it is, abhorrent, okay? The EU has no coherent policy towards Russia. If you want to put Navalny in the center of it, well, then I think a lot of heads need to be examined in Brussels, because that is not in the interest of the European Union by any definition. So it's really kind of throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks here. So I think the EU's foreign policy is the embarrassment at the end of the day. George is absolutely right. Borrell went to Moscow essentially unannounced. I mean, he was just going to go and wing it. Well, that is ridiculous. I mean, you go with an agenda and you make sure that agenda at least comes out neutral, but you never come out of it negative. So, and the Russians actually took this as an opportunity to express their lack of patience. The strategic patience is over. The European Union doesn't know what it wants, and Russia's not going to help it get there. Russia is exhausted by the European Union's behavior. It's exhausted by the Americans' behavior. This never-ending Russiagate hoax. George and I warned about this. It was a domestic political issue. Now it has bled into foreign policy from the West and particularly the United States. So a hoax now is turning into be the centerpiece of the West foreign policy with Russia. That's a disaster.
It has been a disaster. And in some sense, I almost empathize with Borrell, because as a diplomat, he was stumbling. He failed at his job. He didn't perform well. Like you say, he didn't go into it with any agenda, let alone a good one, other than to harangue Russia over Navalny, which I think, again, is a critical mistake. But the thing is, he has been put up to that task sort of de facto by the EU. They didn't ask him to go necessarily, but they have made Navalny their line on Russia this month, over the last couple of months. That's what they're wanting to focus on. And so if he's trying to, get into some new normal, even if it's not a friendly one with Russia, he would need to come to them with some more substantive set of agreements about how they're going to work together in different ways. As it was, he went in and sort of, again, stumblingly harangued them over the issue of Alexei Navalny, who, like you said, in Brussels would not be nearly as well received if the public of the members of these countries, the public of these countries, knew who Navalny was and what he wanted. They would think it's ridiculous that Brussels was seriously proposing him as a genuine political alternative to Putin. So agreed on that count. But isn't it the case that the EU, in some sense, put him in this position, that he didn't give him any other choices because, like you've said, they don't have a solid ambition themselves. They don't know exactly what they want from Russia other than to fit in with the United States strategy of trying to push away from them by whatever hook or crook they could find. George, I'm curious about your take on this. We got about a minute before we need to go into break.
Well, I think that's a very good point, that the EU doesn't have any coherent policy toward Russia. And that seems very strange because the EU was supposed to be an autonomous bloc of powers. And therefore, there is no reason whatsoever why the EU should want to follow America's Russia obsessive hostility. The EU should be able to carve out its own independent foreign policy toward Russia, because there are plenty of common interests, particularly interests involving business, interests involving mutual security, that somebody like Borrell could go to Moscow and discuss. Instead, he goes there and talks about Navalny, which is just antagonizing his hosts, because this is something that the Russians have addressed repeatedly in the past. And Lavrov made the same points over Navalny that he had made over the past, which is If you have evidence that Navalny was poisoned, please provide us with the evidence, and then we will hold an investigation. But don't order us to hold an investigation while you withhold any evidence. And that's what he said, and he's always said that, and it's a very reasonable point. So, it seems extraordinarily foolish for Borrell just simply to antagonize the Russians for no obvious advantage towards the EU.
It's a bad move on his part. We need to go into a break. We'll be back with Peter and George on the other side. For those listening, you've been hearing the voices of Peter Lavelle, American journalist and host of Crosstalk on RT, and George Samueli, senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute. Together, they host Peter Lavelle's The Gaggle. It's a show you can check out now over on YouTube and other platforms, by the way. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back with them on the other side of this break in one short minute.
Fault lines.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to cash them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We've been discussing basically foreign politics. In the last segment, we went with the EU, but I want to move on to an article piece that actually greatly annoyed me. A certain degree of casual xenophobia that more so shows our ignorance as opposed to anything that is saying about the actual world. The piece by Ishan Thoreau, Did We Underestimate the Russian Vaccine? Think about what that's saying for the moment. Who is the we? Why are you underestimating the Russian vaccine? Did you think they were going to be putting lead into people's veins or put something in those people that wasn't going to be beneficial or that wasn't going to work? This piece is astonishingly ridiculous in the premise. It makes the argument that basically this is going to amount to a soft power win for Russia. And it puts it in a way that almost bemoans the fact that it was successful. They're so warped from the standpoint of this kind of neoconish worldview that they just missed the very specific point, that the point of the vaccine was the vaccine. And the fact that the vaccine worked is phenomenal to people who actually need access to the vaccine. This was about COVID. Anything that came beyond that was gravy, but the issue was COVID. And the fact that they could produce the vaccine shows a certain degree of competence, shows a certain degree of skill. And that seems to be something that is bothering this guy. Think about and understand for the moment. This wasn't the first soft power win. Whether you want to talk about the Syria chemical weapons that were being taken away, whether you want to talk about the weapon systems that other countries, even allies of the United States, were buying because they were basically cheaper and Russia didn't have to browbeat those companies. And yeah, the fact that they could produce a vaccine that is just as good and in some ways better does show scientific expertise. And it is a positive thing because other countries, let's say poorer countries that don't have the storage capacity or that can't afford the Western vaccine, can get their hands on it. Peter, we are continued by Peter Lavelle, American journalist and host of Crosstalk on RT, and George Samueli, senior research fellow at Global Policy Institute and author. Together, host of Peter Lavelle's The Gaggle, airing now on YouTube. Peter, I'm going to go to you on this one first. This is so bizarre. And it seems like they're bemoaning the fact that the Russian vaccine worked. And there's this line that nails it. More than a dozen countries have approved the vaccine for use, with more likely to follow now that it has received Lancet seal of approval. Sputnik V is considered considerably cheaper than its Western competitors, does not require the same sort of ultra-cold storage infrastructure that would complicate distribution of the Pfizer vaccine in a much of the developing world. It could amount for a soft power victory for the Kremlin. Isn't that astonishing? What do you have to say about that? There's a certain casual xenophobia in this where they are acting as if they assume that this thing was going to fail. I don't know who the we is in this room. Please expand on that.
I took the Sputnik 5 vaccine already, and I was criticized on Facebook, and I turned around and said, I don't want to give it to Pfizer. I don't want to give it to any big pharma company. I don't want to have anything to do with those people. The Russian government developed it as a cure, a defense against the pandemic. Big Pharma wants to come up with theirs so they can milk the government of taxpayers' dollars. Okay, so, but of course, I mean, it's amazing. The Russians can come up with a vaccine. They put the first man in space. Okay, their technical prowess, if you look at the number of Nobel Prizes for chemistry, physics, and everything, all the other STEM fields, is extraordinary. Probably majority in the history of those prizes. So. Yeah, I mean, I've read the same articles too. I mean, even far worse. Would you take a shot from Putin? I mean, just the you're right. It's not even soft racism. It's acceptable racism is what it is. And we had the case of Ukraine, where the U.S. government and Western ambassadors in Kiev bullied the Kiev government not to take the Russian vaccine, though the Ukrainians have no vaccine on their own, and they're very long down in the queue to get it from their Western friends here. So again, politics in play. Forget the health of people. You know, it doesn't matter. It's who's going to win a soft power victory. No, for me, we have to get, everyone wants to get past this pandemic and these lockdowns and start a semblance of normal life. I really don't care who gets the credit for it. I think most people in the world feel exactly the same way.
I think that pretty much countries themselves who care who gets the credit for it. Now, here's the thing. Jamarl and I were talking about this. This is nevertheless a long-term prestige win. It's almost silly to put it in those terms because, again, first and foremost is the human impact from people being, knowing that they won't suffer the worst effects of getting the virus if they take the vaccines. And like you're saying, being able to reopen our society and resume some semblance of normalcy, even though things will be undoubtedly different and in many ways worse on the other side of this pandemic compared to before it. When you look at, censorship and in general, what the government is able to do with governments around the world with their publics. But I want to come back to the EU for a second, relating to the last conversation we were having on the other side of the break. The EU has had its own bungled vaccine rollout, where Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission's president, herself said they messed up the procurement. They were too optimistic when it came to manufacturing. And even though they have rollout centers in place, they don't have vaccines to send to those inoculation centers. And so people aren't getting them in nearly the quantities that they are in the UK, the United States, other countries. And yet Russia has said they would give their vaccine to the EU. I can't help but think it would have been a better tact for Borrell, and I don't want to fixate on him, but just using that as a point, it would have been a better approach for him to go and talk to them about that. That would have helped the EU more. Is there going to be any process by which the EU has to eat crow on this? How do you see this? How do you see this rolling out? Because again, they need the vaccines. They need this stuff. Their public needs it. It's not just for their governmental stability. Their populations need access to it. I guess I'll turn to you, George. What do you think about this?
Well, you've made excellent points. The EU has bungled the rollout of the vaccine, and therefore there are a number of EU countries that are seeking to get the vaccine from the Russians, namely Hungary. And Hungary has come under attack for doing just that. But everybody has been afflicted by the virus, and therefore every country should be able to act in its own interest and get this vaccine wherever it can. And it's the EU that's playing, and the United States that's playing politics by saying, oh, well, no, you can't have you can't purchase the vaccine from the Russians because that gives the Russians leverage, and we don't want the Russians to score any kind of a win. Well, there isn't any win here other than ordinary people becoming healthy. And that's what it is. This isn't even like Sputnik, where you can say, oh, well, the Russians have scored a big win for a national prestige. This is a life and death issue. And, people should act in accordance with, the life and death matters. Get the vaccine wherever it's available.
That's the other point. It's secondary. Like, the point was to actually get it to work. The vaccine or the foreign policy win and everything else, that was just kind of an experiential show of skill and capability. I mean, yeah, Shane and I were talking about this before. But it's secondary to the process, right? I mean, it's utterly astonishing that they're looking at it like this, especially when many of these other countries would not be able to afford the American vaccine, or for that matter, wouldn't even be able to use it because they don't have the cold storage facilities. I mean, think of Syria, think of Iran, think of Iraq, think of all these other countries. Most of the countries don't consider, is not part of that casual xenophobic we that he's using. Most of those countries are happy that the Russian vaccine works and happy that they can get their hands on it. Please, Peter, continue.
Yeah, gentlemen, does science belong to a political party? Does science have an ideology? Well, maybe in some corners in the UK and the US, but I think on the face of it, science is something that is should have nothing to do with your preferences. Okay, I mean, if someone comes up with a solution to a problem, we should all praise it. Okay, and there's always the financial angle there. The Russians might give it away for free. And where that profit margin disappears. I mean, and particularly in the United States, it's how they look at healthcare as profit. And the Russians don't see it that way at all. The idea is completely alien to them, by the way. So, this article not only is xenophobic, it is a politicizing science.
I want to add one thing in this before we close. Garry Kasparov. I've played chess for years. I've played over Garry Kasparov games for years. Garry Kasparov has gotten to be a maniac at this point. And he's often the go-to guy when they want to say, get information about it. Kasparov made the point and said, basically, at the very least, they should stop giving Putin and other authoritarian regimes leverage and legitimacy with trade deals, membership, and access. Exiled dissident Garry Kasparov. Garry Kasparov lost a computer, got up and flipped out and lost it, and basically put his head in a hole after that, becoming a political dissident. We don't have any issue with working with dictators. It's always the language that they use when they're describing this stuff. We don't have an issue with dictators. Dictators, whether we're talking about Erdogan, whether we're talking about the Saudis, none of these things matter to us. The Tillerson memo made that very clear. We use human rights as a cudgel to hit countries that we don't particularly like, while giving a pass to countries that we do. George, we're about to end this, but there's about a minute. Do you guys want to comment on Garry Kasparov and his comments?
Well, that's a very good point. I mean, Kasparov is a sort of an interesting case. I mean, this is a person who led a very privileged existence in the Soviet Union. I mean, he was a chess champion, and he added a great deal of prestige to the Soviet Union. And for some reason, he has become passionately, obsessively hostile to Russia. And it isn't at all clear what that is about. I mean, as I say, he has always done very well out of Russia. He has always been a highly respected person. But with him, it is a kind of almost like a sick obsession. And unfortunately, given his his past reputation, too many people take him seriously, even though he enjoys no support, no following at all in Russia. Nonetheless, he is listened to. And I think unfortunately, there's a lot of people like that who have come from Russia, but who have built up a kind of a lucrative career in hostility toward Russia and feeding Western obsessions about Russia, whether it's Russiagate or whether it's Putin or whatever. And there's too many people like that, and they have a very bad influence.
It's very strange. I mean, for all of the changes that I would want to make to America, I would not want my country undermined, or the people in that country hurt by policy from other countries. So, yeah, it's weird.
Dan?
The voices that you guys were listening to, Peter Lavelle, American journalist and host of Crosstalk on RT, and George Samueli, Senior Research Fellow at the Global Policy Institute and author. They are together hosts of Peter Lavelle's The Gaggle, airing now on YouTube. You can watch Lavelle's The Gaggle on YouTube and follow Peter on Twitter at PL Crosstalk and George on Twitter at George Samueli. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamal Thomas.
And in the independent corner, and in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan. Sorry for the overlap there.
That means you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines. In the news. There we are. In the news. At least 3,252 new coronavirus deaths and 94,855 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there's been an average of 104,554 cases per day, a decrease of 36% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Thursday morning, more than 27,328,400 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, with over 471,000 that have died. The Cuomo administration has set up 19 COVID-only nursing homes through the state to treat COVID patients who are discharged from hospitals. State Health Commissioner Howard Zucker revealed the establishment of the coronavirus-only nursing homes in a 16-page letter sent to the state legislature Wednesday, which was his response to a series of questions submitted by lawmakers who chair committees overseeing nursing homes. Governor Andrew Cuomo and his health department came under fierce criticism last spring during the worst of the COVID-19 outbreak, when thousands of recovering coronavirus patients were released from hospitals and sent to nursing homes. Some nursing home operators claimed a March 25th state health department directive pressured them to admit or readmit COVID-19 patients at a time when they were already overwhelmed by the outbreak. At the time of the nursing homes were not allowed to test new admissions for COVID-19, had inadequate personal protective equipment, and suffered from staff shortages. Just to put a fine point on this, people need to realize that with all of the deaths that were taking place from COVID-19, especially when we're talking about last spring, 42% of the people that died took place in 0.6% of the population. That 0.6% were nursing homes. So basically, these were kill facilities that incompetence drove those numbers up. That number didn't have to be that way. That was an issue of incompetence. And you have a situation where Cuomo undercut that number by half to make himself look far better than what he deserved to be. The guy wrote the book on leadership with 44,000 deaths, talking about he lays and sleeps on his pillow well. Maybe you should not. Maybe you should not. Mayor Eric Garcetti said Los Angeles' 5 city-run vaccination sites, including Dodger Stadium, will close on Friday and Saturday due to lack of doses. The city will have exhausted its current supply of Moderna vaccine for the first dose appointments by Thursday, forcing the temporary closures. The city has administered 293,000 doses so far at its 5 vaccination sites, a 27% distribution increase since last week, and is averaging about 13,000 doses a day. Dodger Stadium, one of the largest mass vaccination sites in the country, has capacity to inoculate up to 12,000 people a day. The city will receive 16,000 new doses this week, down from 90,000 the week before and 29,000 from the week before that. This is not a show of competence. Just to point that out, this is not a show of competence. Honestly, it is not. There is no reason. It's maddening. When I think back, or when I think of stuff like this, my comparison, my point of view has to do with the Second World War. We ramped up production from the standpoint of something that was important to be able to supply weapons and munitions, food, all across the world. We were funding the world's war effort to take down the Nazis on this particular front, or to take down the Japanese. And yet, when it's needed to get a vaccine, how many people died on 9/11? What, 3,000? Let's say 4,000, just to be on the safe side, even though it was a little bit less than 4,000. We had that many people die nearly every day. And for whatever particular reason, we can't marshal the forces and the mechanisms of the United States government, the infrastructure, to build these items that we need in order to keep people alive. This is embarrassing. That's my point. It's an embarrassment. And it's not necessarily something that should happen, especially when you have this many people dying of this particular illness. If there are people who want that vaccine, those people should be able to get that vaccine, and it shouldn't be an issue of not or lack of supply. Shane, what do you think about this? Am I being too hard on these guys in regards to doing this particular task or this particular job? It should have been done long time ago. The moment that these things started, it should have been a ramp up. They should have been ready for it. And the honest reality of it is, it's unclear whether or not the issue is under Biden or under Trump. Most likely it's under Trump because they didn't necessarily have the storage factor, the facilities for that stuff, despite the fact Trump screaming about having those things. So Biden can, say Trump did a horrible job on this and kind of get a little bit of leeway on that. But whether or regardless of whose fault it is, it's embarrassing. And it's not something that should have prospered in a country like this, richest country on the planet, and yet incapable of doing just basic things. What do you think, Shane?
Yeah, we were way behind the ball on this one. We should have been ahead of the curve on it, and we weren't. Meanwhile, like we were just talking about with Peter and George, we're criticizing Russia. We're sort of, having to ignore the egg on our face by criticizing Russia obliquely for having developed a vaccine sooner than us, and one that appears to be, extremely effective, up at the head of the pack there with other vaccines around the world. So instead of doing that, instead of wasting time pushing more of our geopolitical ambitions, or the leftovers of them at least, we should have been focused on repairing the state of our health system at home. We should have been on that. And this is something I've been saying for a while. I mean, if you look at during the early stages of the pandemic, I think back in January, when I believe it was January, when various health officials received the code of COVID, when they received the genetic code of the virus, they at that point were, in the course of just a couple of days, a couple of weeks, able to create a vaccine that is effectively the one that we see being distributed in its form today. Now, we had to go through trials. That process took a long time. We've had to go through the manufacturing ramp up. That's taken a long time. In my opinion, I'm not going to put this on Trump. This is a problem in general with our society, with the institutions responsible for handling this, specifically the CDC and the FDA. We should have had this stuff. We should have had the protocols in place to get this kind of thing created, tested, and rolled out much more quickly. And ideally, you would have done all of those things pretty much concurrently. So as soon as you had a vaccine to test, you start testing it. And then on the off chance that it works, you start manufacturing it. Sure, you're going to waste some resources if it doesn't work and you've manufactured something, you spent time and people's energy manufacturing something that doesn't work, but you'd have it that much sooner, frankly. You'd have that much more of it, and you'd be in a much better position to do the rollout. And ideally, we'd be ahead of the pack right now. We'd be out in front. As far as I can tell, Israel is the country that has vaccinated the most of its population by far at this point. Now, partly that's because they're a small country and they were able to get a bunch of these vaccines delivered early, but still, we could have been ahead of them if we'd handled this well. And unfortunately, we wasted our time in various other ways. Anyway, I've said my piece on that, Jamal.
I agree with you. I mean, look, I don't think it goes beyond the vaccine. I mean, it goes to the mask, it goes to protective equipment, it goes to all that stuff. I mean, because honestly, you wouldn't have needed as much of the vaccine if you would have had all of these people either dying or infected in the first place. And so it's like, I agree with you. It's not just one administration or the other. It's kind of the entirety of it. But yeah, I do place it on Trump on that. Because he was president when all of this stuff was taking place. He was coming up with these ludicrous things. We're going to be in church next month. Then after, a few months later, 5,000 people a day are dying. So, I do put blame on that front. There's also something a little bit more, and this is a slight tangent. I'm sick of these foreign policy nonsense, right? We spend $1 trillion a year, and for the longest time, basically hunting down people in caves and mud huts. And we're somehow trying to justify spending that much money on that. We have these weird issues. I mean, for God's sake, when Gorbachev was in office, there was an honest and actual chance for this kind of peace with the U.S. It was there. It was there for the taking. And instead of us taking it, we basically took advantage. And here we are. And we're shocked that other countries would be bothered by the fact that we took advantage, causing tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of deaths in this kind of shock capitalism stuff. Yeah, it's aggravating to me. That's all. It's like when you go through stories like this, and it's like this kind of phony conflict. And it's, yeah, people have their things that they want, but actually a lot of this conflict comes from this notion of dominance and trying to prevent any other institutional organization like the Soviet Union from ever coming into existence again, because it was a peer. We don't want peers, which, again, will put you in conflict by definition as other countries like China or Russia expand, and they have every right to do so. So yeah, I get sick of the foreign policy stuff. And when that comes into it, and it's like, if you're going to be that way, then you still have to have expertise in being able to do basic things for your particular society. And when stuff like this comes up, when you can't do those things, it's bothering to me because of the amount of money we spend on other things. It's this. This is the stuff that you need to be able to be competent and efficient on for your own population. And so don't tell me about the $1 trillion necessary to modernize nuclear weapons if you can't assure that vaccines get to the people that need them. It seems like a betrayal of responsibilities. So yeah, I mean, I'm not going to beat a horse, but you get my point. The United States will turn away most migrants apprehended at its border with Mexico under the Trump-era policy, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said yesterday, adding that the move will limit the spread of COVID pandemic would also give new administration ample time to implement new migrant policies. Although President Joe Biden vowed to undo Trump's border rules, he has in place a provision called Title 42, which allows American authorities to rapidly expel people crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. The number of migrant families with children and unaccompanied minors apprehended by U.S. agents along the southern border increased last month. Out of 78,000 arrests in January, nearly 65,000 involved single adults. Customs and Border Protections reported detaining nearly 5,900 unaccompanied minors and making 7,500 apprehensions of parents and children traveling together in January. In December, U.S. officials made fewer than 4,700 apprehensions of families and near 5,000 of unaccompanied children. As I read that, I was coming into mind with ICE. ICE is a maniac organization that needs to be broken in some way. The rule set that ICE was going by was basically instantiated under Trump in the last days of Trump, making it difficult for Joe Biden to basically unravel and stop some of the things that ICE have been doing. This includes deporting Haitians, some of which were babies, despite the fact that this was not something that we should have been doing. Joe Biden is going to have a lot on his hands for that, and it's going to be interesting to see how he handles those Trump-era policies. House impeachment manager today will finish arguing the case that former President Donald Trump incited an insurrection one day after they showed violent and disturbing video footage of the attack on the U.S. Capitol as they urged senators to convict at the Senate trial. Never before seen Capitol security footage forced senators to relive the harrowing attacks and confront chilling new details about the incredible serious threat posed to everyone on Capitol Hill, including lawmakers. A number of GOP senators made clear Wednesday evening that they were shaken by what they saw, but still signaled they won't change how they plan to vote as Trump appeared headed towards an acquittal at the conclusion of the trial. Yeah, that footage was pretty astonishing, actually. You had situations where senators and Congress members basically being moved out at the exact time where one door over, rioters were basically attacking the place. So this idea that, oh, these guys were not in threat. No, they were in threat. We're talking about like a minute, if it that much time, between the time that the people were being able to get out. You had situations where they were pushing their bodies against the door to try to prevent rioters from coming in. You had cops that were being beaten, one of which killed, holding a Trump flag as they did it. Yeah, these people were in danger. The guy with the zip ties. And what's interesting, and we probably should end it here, were that the video that they showed came from Status Quo. They took that video down on YouTube saying that the content was harmful, that there was something wrong with the content, and yet the content was perfectly reasonable and factual enough to have in the trial of Donald Trump. If that is not an indictment of the ridiculousness of the way YouTube behaves with this stuff, I don't know what is. Shane, you have anything to say about that before we close our headlines?
No, let's just go into it. Let's go out. I've already said my piece on that. Thank you, though.
Excellent. All right. Well, those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
tells you more.
Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Based on what has been taking place over the last, let's say, year or so, with Donald Trump screaming about the China virus, with Donald Trump screaming that the problem with the Chinese and not his incompetence, or for that matter, with the trade war that basically erupted between the U.S. and China when, yes, Donald Trump took a belligerent approach to China, passing sanctions in which China responded in their own sanctions because they consider themselves a peer, and no peer would allow themselves to be talked down to or treated in such a way without a response. Tit for tat is basically the only policy that you have, short of some kind of further escalation. Whereas Donald Trump's trade deals were all over the place, the sanctions. China was very targeted and going after people that would hurt Trump in his campaign, especially the issue of farmers. 1.3 billion people. Now, the United States, if they lose access to that, who are those farmers going to sell their products to that is going to be able to get to 1.3 billion people? You can kind of see the problem. With the coronavirus and Donald Trump screaming to high heaven that it's the China virus and it's China's fault, the American public believe that on some level, despite the fact that they still blame Trump. It's kind of like the Russiagate thing, that yes, they accepted the fact that the Russia thing maybe was there, but they, for the most part, didn't all that much care about it. Well, with this, they do care, because it seems like a lot of the focus has been on China, and that focus has been specifically put by the Trump administration, and honestly, even by Democrats. Around 2/3 of Americans, 64%, say China has done a bad job dealing with the coronavirus outbreak. Around 3/4, 78%, place a fair amount of blame on the global spread of coronavirus on the Chinese government and its handling of the COVID break in Wuhan. That's astonishing. Now, this, when China has actually done quite well on this particular subject. The wild part about this is that hate crimes have started to spike precipitously. As the Queen Chronicle noted back in September, New York Police Department data showed that there has been 1,900% increase in anti-Asian hate crimes in New York in the past year. There were 20 incidents in the first half of 2020 alone compared to 1 in all of 2019. In August 2020, a UN report found that there were more than 1,800 racist incidents against Asian Americans in the United States over an 8-week period from March to May 20th, meaning the attacks on China that have been stoked by the political space is having consequences that go beyond just the rhetoric. Joining us to discuss is Ian Goodman, senior editor and columnist at China Daily. Ian, thank you for joining us, man. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Appreciate it. When the political space uses this sort of language, meaning blame, because that's basically what they did. It's China's fault, the trade deal, the China virus, when the reality of it is China responded remarkably fast. And in fact, the attacks were going to them being too heavy-handed in trying to deal with the virus. They were successful in dealing with it. The rest of the world can see that they were dealing with it. So the idea that the world didn't understand or know the severity of it was off the table. The World Health Organization, the United States had people in the World Health Organization to make it very clear on the severity of the virus. So basically, the stuff that was coming out about China not dealing with us was just politics. And those politics have had horrible consequences. Please expand upon that. I mean, from your point of view, in regards to, the bizarreness of this, or better yet, the horrible aspect of political language and the consequences of that political language. Please, Ian Goodrum, explain and expand.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is, as you mentioned, the escalation, the enormous escalation in hate crimes against Asian Americans, by a factor of several hundred in 2020 compared to 2019. This is the ground level result of high level political rhetoric, right? Like, this is how we see it play out in day-to-day life in your average 24-hour period life as a person in a country, Asian American or otherwise. The incidences of violent moments, attacks, brutalization of people for the color of their skin, an association with this perceived enemy, and then just the verbal assaults that have happened too. I mean, this is very, very common. You see videos popping up all the time of this kind of racist hate being spewed out, in no small part due to this kind of war of words and escalation of sanctions and attacks. In order to, it's not bad enough that there's hundreds of thousands of Americans dead from this virus, and thousands more getting infected every day and thousands more dying every day. But because of the direct result of the direct cause of this horrible mass death status quo that the U.S. is facing right now, it's not bad enough that this is happening. It's also bad because in an attempt to deflect from the response that has led to this horrible result, has led to its own consequences. As you said, the attempt to kind of shift blame from the U.S. and its own failings to China, right? It wasn't China that forced the U.S. to only adopt a testing kit from the CDC, ignoring the testing kit the WHO had put together and that China had put together for the test, thus delaying the early testing regimen and allowing tons and tons and tons of infections to slip through the cracks and expand and fester. It's not China's fault that there was a bottleneck that persists to this day of essential protective equipment and materials necessary to protect frontline healthcare workers, people at risk from being infected. Of course, we know that is a serious situation. And even now, masks are being reused by healthcare personnel when there is an oversupply. There was a story in the New York Times actually that published, I believe, this morning about how there's 30 million masks just sitting in a warehouse somewhere, not getting to where they need to go because of this bizarre system that the U.S. has set up in terms of purchasing this equipment. That none of that's China's fault. China informed the WHO on December 31st, when they didn't even know that it was a novel coronavirus, when all they knew about it so far was that it was a pneumonia of unknown cause. This is how the terminology evolved. And throughout January, there were new updates. There was new information. As the severity of the situation became clearer, as more cases came in, the seriousness of it, once it was recognized, there was an immediate and comprehensive response. I was here. I've been in China this whole time. I live in Beijing. Thankfully, that's a place that has not been hit as hard as other places. Wuhan being the most obvious one. But there was an immediate rapid response of locking things down, putting out enormous material in terms of protective equipment and testing kits, mass testing, which is a key aspect of containing the virus, which again did not happen in the U.S. because of this bizarre insistence on a CDC test kit. It also wasn't the U.S.'s. It also wasn't China's fault that the U.S. didn't do the short-term lockdown and pay people to stay home. The most obvious solution to this problem, in addition to centralized quarantine, there was a blueprint. Right? There was a blueprint that had been put together over the course of December, January, and February when the outbreak was at its worst in China. And in its hubris, in its absolute arrogance, The U.S. treated this as a purely China problem. As you mentioned, there were tons of pieces in newspapers condemning China for its authoritarian violation of civil liberties with the lockdown and with this centralized quarantine. That was such a violation of human rights. And yet, the result of that is, despite some local blips, some local upswings in cases that you see from time to time, life in China has returned to largely normal. It is a more mask-wearing normal, but it is a recognizable normal way of life. So it's very tragic and very unsettling and disturbing to see that these kinds of attacks are happening on the ground as an expression of this kind of rhetoric that we saw and heard nonstop after March, after there was a need to shift blame.
Ian, thank you for joining us. Great overview there. I'll ask you two questions and hand it back over to you. For one thing, on these new attacks, has the Chinese government responded to them in any way as far as you know? And then two, you were talking about how life has returned to normal, like we were talking about in our headlines recently. There was a recent day in which China reported no new community transmitted cases of COVID. All the cases they were able to detect came from outside the country, which is insane if you look at it and compare it with the United States, where we're celebrating the fourth day in a row with less than 100,000 new infections. Now, admittedly, there's some differences there. They were not reporting in China people who were asymptomatic in those numbers. So, there are some differences there, but still the obvious differences are stark.
Well,
we have handled a lot worse.
I do want to make a small correction there. Asymptomatic numbers are reported. They're just reported as separate figures from the confirmed cases. So
thank you.
The asymptomatic cases started getting put out in February, March, and that was yet another point where people were saying there was a cover up. But I mean, as we saw in every country, there's been shifts in how cases are reported, which is not evidence of a cover up. It's an evidence of evolving understanding of the nature of the virus. But anyway, please keep going. Sorry.
Absolutely. We only have so much time, so I'll hand it right over to you. Just to return to the first question, has China responded? And then for the second question, with the return to normalcy, how has the pandemic so far affected China's economy from what you've seen in terms of its makeup, manufacturing, all that throughout the course of it? Ian.
Yeah. In terms of responses to these kinds of hate crimes, I mean, there hasn't been like an all of government kind of response other than just strict, obvious condemnation and an expression of solidarity with the victims. And this is true even for people that aren't ethnically Chinese, because there are people that aren't ethnically Chinese who are being attacked because they look vaguely Asian, and to a bigot, to somebody who has these kinds of thoughts festering, it doesn't matter whether someone's from China or Vietnam or Korea or Southeast Asia, like another country. They're acting on a racist impulse that doesn't discriminate or differentiate. Well, I mean, they discriminate, but they don't differentiate between varieties of East Asians or Southeast Asians. So they all are targets. So even in cases where there was not somebody ethnically Chinese being attacked, China has expressed solidarity and sympathy for the victims and condemned the attacks, which I think every right-thinking person can do and should do. As far as the economy, the short-term effect was very strong and severe for the first quarter of 2020. There was an enormous downturn in productive activity. There was an enormous downturn in economic activity, and that reflected in the GDP, which saw huge decreases from period to period, year to year, that it hadn't seen since, I believe, the early 90s. But since the first quarter, the recovery has been equally swift. Because the lockdown period, the period of severe containment, where you had these kinds of temporary hospitals being built and people put into centralized quarantine for a period long enough, for people that had confirmed cases but mild or no symptoms, you had that period of extreme diligence, a diligence that persists, but the containment measures are not so strict now because there's not as much of a need for them due to the success of the initial containment. So. In fact, the recovery has been rapid enough and serious enough that China has been the only major economy to see total growth for the year, 2.3% growth for the entire year, despite that first quarter severe downturn. It's also been forecasted to surpass the U.S. economy in terms of GDP earlier than scheduled. I believe 6 or 7 years earlier than scheduled now. And that's also reflected in the amount of foreign direct investment. China is now an even bigger recipient of foreign direct investment than the United States. So there was that initial period of a large downturn and a large slowdown, to be polite, but that has been matched. It is the V-shaped recovery that we heard so much about in the early months of the pandemic in the U.S. has happened in China.
Very interesting. Ian, we're out of time. That was a great overview. Thank you so much for joining us.
And thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Great to have you. Always a pleasure on our end, too. For those listening, that was Ian Goodrum, senior editor and columnist at China Daily. You can follow Ian on Twitter, by the way, at @ISGoodrum. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break, but when we come back, we will be joined by Misty Winston talking about Assange, as the Biden administration has announced in the last few days that they will continue to seek his extradition, continuing the Trump administration's policies, not Obama's, by the way. We'll come back to that. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back with Misty on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Misty's not here yet.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And I'm going to give you a quick heads up on where you can find us. If you want to listen to us on the air in Washington, D.C., we're on the radio, 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also on in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. And if you like what Jamal and I are putting down, you can like and share our content. You can check us out. We're on YouTube right now on Fault Lines Radio. Jamarl's channel has gone through some speed bumps. It's hit some hiccups after YouTube blocked it for nothing for a private. Do you want to go into that briefly? We're still bringing our guests on.
Yeah.
But Jamarl, can you just give another
quick
heads up on this stuff?
Yeah, I'll make it real quick. So initially, there was a mass purge. That mass purge shut down multiple channels, not just my own. It basically demonetized the channels. Now, understand, the reason that they would do a demonetization is because they don't necessarily want to take the hard idea of kicking you off their network, because that would breach Section 230 in very clear terms. So they want to incentivize you to leave. Now, I reacted strongly about this because it was bogus. They're trying to make the argument that the content was harmful. YouTube gives me an apology. Hey, we're sorry for taking your site down. We're sorry for the revenue that you lost while you took your site down. We were a little over aggressive and going about kicking off other sites. Now, they didn't do this for others, but they definitely did this for my site, where they brought my site back on into the same port of monetization. I do a video the very next day, and they shut the site down entirely. Now, they tried to say that I was either spamming, or for that matter, spamming, or being deceptive. They could not disassociate the context of playing a video with Trump talking about the election, or, for that matter, Sidney Powell talking about the Cubans and Hugo Chavez working to undermine Donald Trump with Governor Kemp. They couldn't disassociate a video owning those people, saying that these people were ludicrous and ridiculous, from a video that wasn't doing those things. And then they made the argument that it was spam, a video that was unlisted, that never was going to be seen because it was unlisted. No views, and yet they call it spam. It's just very bizarre. That's all. And so I've been in a fight back and forth. The person from YouTube Creators have actually been quite nice in responding, saying, look, I'm trying to get your case. I'm trying to push them to come to a conclusion on this. I'll hit you up when they let off. But right now, the channel is still down. It is spurless claims and honestly slanderous and defamatory to say that the channel is harmful or anything like that. There's nothing there that is like that. They had no evidence on the last one. And on this particular point, they're wrong. And so that's where we are with that. It's a fight that's taking place.
It's bizarre.
Yes.
I just wanted to give people a quick heads up. Thanks for the overview. We have our guest on, so I'm gonna turn to her. Let's get into the conversation. Julian Assange, founder of WikiLeaks, still languishes in prison while awaiting a British judge's deliberation on the U.S.'s appeal on his extradition, which British Judge Vanessa Barretser denied on grounds that he suffered from autism and posed a suicide risk if incarcerated in the United States jails. This was early January last month. This follows years of Assange's residency in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Assange's mental and physical health have deteriorated significantly over the course of his detainment. And this week, the Biden administration has announced that it would continue to seek Assange's extradition, leaving the appeal standing and leaving journalism under attack. A coalition of civil liberties and human rights groups have asked the Biden administration to end the push for Assange's extradition. It was in a letter organized by the Freedom of the Press Foundation and co-signed by major organizations, including the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, Amnesty International USA, the Center for Constitutional Rights, the Committee to Protect Journalists, Demand Progress, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Human Rights Watch, many others, to discuss the United States actions, Assange's health status, and the extradition appeal process. We are now joined by Misty Winston, a political activist, organizer, and co-host of both the Facts on the Ground podcast, and the Free Assange Vigils. Misty, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Hey, thank you for being with us. Let's talk. Why do you think Biden's admin is continuing to seek the extradition of Julian Assange? Let's start there. What's your take?
Well, I think that as an Assange activist, we've all kind of been waiting for this. We weren't anticipating that Biden would be much better on this issue. I mean, historically speaking, he's been, pretty tough on. I mean, he's called Julian Assange a high-tech terrorist, which is the exact same language that Mitch McConnell used. So I think as activists, we all kind of knew that this was coming. We had a little bit of hope that he would maybe do the right thing here and drop the appeal, but it doesn't look like he's going to do that. So I think that this is, the fight continues, and we're just going to have to amp up our efforts and, try to get in his ear to do the right thing.
It is bizarre, though, right? I mean, because Obama wouldn't go this far. Like, Obama understood that this was a slippery slope and that media in and of itself in the United States would be open to prosecution by a particular president or by a Justice Department if they didn't particularly like what they were saying, as this is a slippery slope. The man is a journalist, and if you go after him, you basically allow fair game on Washington Post, New York Times, particularly any of these guys who at any particular point crosses a president or crosses the Justice Department that it doesn't particularly like, right? I mean, so why on earth? It's like he's not listening to his boss.
It's a direct attack on the freedom of the press. I mean, it's disturbing that Joe Biden is willing to do this. I can't say that it's unexpected. We all have been sort of anticipating it, like I said, but this is a direct attack on press freedom. And really what we need to see happen now is for journalists to come out in support of Julian Assange, because over the course of the past 10 years, journalists, even ones that he has worked closely with before on publishing some of these stories, have turned their backs on him. And so we need journalists, major journalists from major outlets like CNN and MSNBC and Fox News and the Washington Post and the New York Times to all stand up and speak out about how dangerous this is as far as an attack on press freedom, because this does criminalize investigative journalism moving forward.
And Misty, to make this point that much more, appropriate, Rachel Maddow hates Julian Assange, hates his guts, because from the Democratic point of view, Assange was the one that got Trump elected. I mean, these people are lunatics on this stuff. Like, they're howler monkeys. So Joe Biden has all of this pressure on his back to do something about this. And Assange is the guy that they're trying to use for it. They tortured Chelsea Manning for months, tortured her for months in order to get her to break, and she never broke. So what evidence exactly do you have, since the person that you were torturing to get that evidence didn't speak? And so Rachel Maddow even came out and said, yeah, he's weird, but this is an attack on press freedom. She did this last year. So if Maddow, who hates his guts, comes out and recognizes that this is a problem, where's everyone else? Why don't they get that this is a problem?
I would love to know the answer to that, Jim Morrow. I would love to know where everybody else is. And it's not even just journalists, although they should certainly be leading the charge on this. It's even our progressive politicians. Bernie Sanders has never spoken a word about Julian Assange. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was asked by Jeremy Scahill and gave a very weak answer. The rest of the squad has been completely silent.
Yep.
So it's really mind-boggling to me that we have politicians on the quote-unquote left remaining completely silent on an issue as important as, the First Amendment.
They're radically weak on it. I mean, let's call it what it is. Like Sanders is terrified of it because in his head, especially when he was running during the election, Democrats, howler monkeys on this very specific issue. So yeah, he was terrified of it. He couldn't touch it. AOC, same thing. It's a hot rail that they don't particularly want to touch despite the attacks on press freedom. This should be something that these guys lean into, especially now when everything is going on. What do you think this goes?
Yeah.
I mean, do you think, and I know you don't know this, but do you think he's going to be dragged back to the U.S.? I mean, the judge basically pushed through and said that he'd off himself if he was ever brought back to the U.S. because the jails and the prisons in the U.S. are so uniquely bad. And mind you, he's languishing in Belmarsh, which is a torture facility in and of itself. So, This is such a bizarre standoff. What happens from here? What's the next step?
Just as far as our activism goes, we're going to amp up the pressure that we're putting on the Biden campaign. This should be an issue that is a no-brainer for him. But Barack Obama, like you said earlier, wouldn't even go this far. So it should be a no-brainer for him to drop this appeal and let it go. On March 17th, we're going to do the hashtag Clovers for Assange started, about a year ago. So with St. Patrick's Day coming up, we're going to use that to center an event around that. So we're going to be in Washington, D.C. on March 17th. We'll also have an event planned in April. You can find information about that at actionforassange.com. But moving forward, I think we just have to really ramp up the pressure. We have to really put pressure on the Biden administration, and we have to really put pressure on these journalists and these politicians to speak out against this. It has now reached crisis level it's always been crisis level, but we're now at the point where if this appeal if the prosecution is successful on this appeal, I think personally they're going to just try to drag it out and let him sit in prison for as long as possible. I think that, they're hoping that they can just break him down little by little over the course of years of dragging out an appeals process. But if he is extradited to the United States, that is, basically a death sentence for Julian Assange. The judge already has said so, and for her to know that and say it out loud in court, I think is pretty telling. So moving forward, I just think we have to amp up the pressure. I mean, silence is complicity. If you're silent on this issue, you are complicit in what's happening to your First Amendment rights. So it's time to step up and speak out.
On the subject of what's happening next, what's the next step in the extradition appeal process? When is that being heard? Who's hearing it? What do you expect to happen there, Misty?
So there's the deadline for they filed the appeal, and then they have 2 weeks to present their case for the appeal. And the deadline for that is Friday. So we will have some more information on Friday. I'm not sure where it goes from there. I know it goes to a higher court. I don't know if we have a judge assigned to the case yet as far as once it gets to the next court. So I'm looking forward to finding all of that information out tomorrow once we learn a little bit more. But I don't think that this is, I don't think it's going to be an easy fix. I think that there were some activists that were hoping that it would be a case of, Biden's here and he'll fix this. That's clearly not going to be the case. Joe Biden is going to have to be pressured to do the right thing on this issue, which is unfortunate from a man who regularly quotes Thomas Jefferson on press freedom. So, we're just going to have to amp up pressure and see if we can get him to recognize, the danger of what he's doing here.
One last point before we close out. Mainstream media. Why on earth is the attack on Assange like this, but not on mainstream media? And what does it mean that the attack is on Assange like this for releasing data versus mainstream media? What is it that Assange is releasing that apparently mainstream media doesn't necessarily touch, where the rail is not that hot?
Well, Julian Assange offers us something that no other journalist organization has ever offered us, and that is pristine, authenticated source documentation. What WikiLeaks provides is not conjecture, it's not speculation, it's not some talking head giving their opinion. It is, verifiable source documentation where you are shown the evidence and, asked to think for yourself. And I think that terrifies the people in power. I think that they know that he is very good at what he does. And I think that he has a 100% record of accuracy. No other journalist organization has ever had a record like that. So, while you have, and really he revolutionized journalism, because now every journalist organization uses the secure Dropbox like WikiLeaks invented. So, this is something that he used to revolutionize journalism that they've all benefited from. And like I said earlier, have very conveniently turned their backs on him once they don't need him anymore. So
they ran the stories. They ran The Guardian, The Washington Post, the New York. All of them ran those stories, and yet they're not the ones that are being prosecuted. He is. It's astonishing case. He languished for 7 years, and just to end it, the torture was the point. I think people need to realize that being publicly tortured for doing what he did, just basically giving truth to the public, was the point.
The process is the punishment.
Exactly.
The process is the punishment in this case.
Exactly. The
100%.
voice that you guys are listening to is Misty Winston, political activist, organizer, and co-host of both Facts on the Ground podcasts and the hashtag Free Assange Vigils. You can follow Misty on Twitter at Sarcasm Stardust. I follow her on Twitter myself. And the Facts on the Ground podcast on YouTube and on Twitter at FOTG Podcast. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment in a dedicated segment about UFOs. And Lord knows I am going to wild out. You don't want to miss that. Back in a moment.
Fault Lines. What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. For this segment, this is going to be a dedicated segment. I tried to get a guest on this for a while, but our typical guest hadn't responded. So, me, being dedicated to this issue for nearly a decade, I am going to carry this segment on my own. They say when I talk about UFOs, I look like a younger man, so I'm going to look like I'm 18 in this particular segment because I am going to wild out. Everything that I say in this segment is flat, fact, true. It's phenomenal, yes, and yet it is flat, fact, true. It is the reason that your government is studying this issue. It is the reason why the woo-woo stuff and the research papers on all of these odd physics and everything else, on psi phenomena, on consciousness, all of that stuff is being studied right now, not just in the United States, but also in Russia and China and other countries as they try to backtrack the technology that they found from various crafts that have crashed. Again, I want to reiterate, everything that I'm saying is true. All of the people that you're about to hear from, or this very specific case, Bigelow, was the man at the center of the larger program. Luis Elizondo is the one that gets a lot of credit for this. He's the one that was standing out in the shadows. That's the spook that came out and says, yes, I was running the Black Budget program, the ATIP program. Yes, we were studying these things from a scientific point of view. We are being visited. He was the person. When all of the reporters were talking to the pilots, when the signals data and everything else, he was the guy that was doing those interviews, Luis Elizondo. However, Luis Elizondo only was doing a small part of that particular program. Bob Bigelow was the CEO that won the contract from the U.S. government to study this stuff. He was well suited. He was already to some degree in the field. He was able to use his own resources to transform the laboratory in order to study the phenomena in the project. And to go further, he had a living laboratory of radical weirdness. Things that you would call poltergeist activities at Skinwalker Ranch. Oftentimes, I don't even go into this because it's so weird. It goes beyond the UFO thing, but it doesn't. The DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, was working with Bigelow, visited Skinwalker Ranch, and was freaked out sufficiently enough where he got money in order to study that with the hopes that the psi phenomena at that particular facility would give them some context to the high weirdness associated with UFOs. It is very strange. They did everything that they could think of to try to study it. In one case, they would have a camera looking at another camera, and despite the fact that they were looking at the camera was pointed, one of the other cameras basically unraveled on video, and they couldn't necessarily figure out how it happened. You had other situations where phenomena would do things in front of people. The DIA agent that came basically was staring at something that was happening in space that the other people didn't see because they didn't have the thing. He goes out and says, hey, did you guys see anything? And sheepishly eventually tells about what he was seeing when he was there. That laboratory allowed them to study very weird and bizarre phenomena, even though they couldn't get to the bottom of the weird, bizarre phenomena, because despite all of the tests that him and his researchers, they had an entire crew of scientists and researchers, it would defy explanation. And the labs and the repeatable results and everything else that we typically take for science, it was as if something was laughing at the researchers. That part is part of the astonishing part. The other part is the issue of UFOs. I'm going to show you various clips from Bigelow as he talks about this. And again, he is being interviewed. As this interview takes place, again, I want to reiterate, everything that he is saying is true. Let's go to the first clip on whether or not he's seen technology. Let's play the first clip. And going into this issue of technology is really real.
You can imagine how far you would have gone if they'd been allowed to continue with 50 or more employees plugging away, going around the world, interacting with, acquiring other government files, going out to hotspots, investigating boots on the ground incidents, UFO cases, other phenomena, versus what exists now. The UAP task force, 2 or 3 people, no budget. I mean, you could have really made a dent in this topic and the big questions.
Well, and you're leaving out, the kind of the holy grail of the topic, machinery.
Yeah. Is there machinery? That's what the New York Times story, which we'll talk about in a second. New York Times reported that you modified your facility here in order to house some material from somewhere else. Did you ever have it?
We never had any.
Do you ever see any?
Do you see things that are photos, or do you see things in person and so forth? So you don't want to talk about stuff in case it happens in the future.
Yeah.
And because who knows what might happen in terms of a coalescing of intersections that could happen. And so
you don't want to spill any beans that causes it puts you in a bad light somewhere down the road.
Well, I think that machinery really does exist. It does exist. And so, but the problem has been the inability to back engineer. And I kind of think that some things require a weightless environment. So part of that is we don't have it here terrestrially. So what you need is a manufacturing facility where there's a weightless environment.
It's part of the reason you develop Bigelow Aerospace.
For certain amalgams and certain kinds of things, but it's also like, it doesn't do you much good to own a sliver of a case that holds a cell phone to understand, was it even a case? Was it holding something, and what was that something it was holding?
Let's stop right there for a moment. Think about what he's saying. Like, he's basically making the point that, like in sci-fi movies, they just plug their laptop in and it's like, okay, all of a sudden they're using alien technology. The problem is more legitimate than that. If you get a piece of technology, how do you know what the technology is? How do you know how that technology is used? And more importantly, the technology that at their disposal, Bigelow was making the point that it contains a psi function, meaning it took consciousness to operate the technology. And we're not even at a point to be able to understand what that means, because we don't consider consciousness this thing that's aspect of reality. In fact, if you're looking at double slit experiments and the point of view of the person is basically dictating whether or not it's a wave or whether it's the particle, you're getting to something that's fundamental, that the individual person, their perspective of the world on some level affects the world. He's basically pointing out that we're not at a point, scientifically or conscious aspect, to even understand how the technology works. And just because you get a sliver of it doesn't necessarily mean you can understand the entirety of it. You're looking at a cell phone case trying to figure out what it does, wondering whether it's magic or something like that, when you miss the fact that it's just a case for something else. This is the problem that these guys are running into. They don't know what they don't know. And even if they get a small bit of information on one, it doesn't entirely give context to the other. Think about dropping a nuclear submarine back in the 1600s, giving them all the resources and the money and the time at their disposal. What if they learn to open the door? They probably think it's an amazing thing. There's another part, the idea that they're trying to bury the project. He even goes into the idea and the problem with weaponry. Let's play the next clip, talking about a Manhattan Project that's needed in order to even get to the point of trying to understand what this stuff does. Let's play the next one.
So that was a lot of fun to do that.
I know that you did knock on many doors during the OSAP, during the BASS program, and that doors got slammed as you're asking for sensitive stuff, or access to sensitive stuff.
Yeah.
Is the secrecy directly related to what you were just talking about, the military imperative? We're going to hold on to this stuff and figure out how to make weapons out of it, and we got to get there before the Russians and Chinese do, because they are working on it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely crashes been reported in Russia, and I've heard of them in China, South America, Brazil. They're scattered all around.
All right, let's stop it right there because we're running a little short on time and I want to hit the last part. There's also an effort to bury this. Luis Elizondo, when he was asked about this, he made the point. They asked him, did he say anything that made him say, holy cow? He says, absolutely, I'm not going to go further than that. Did you see any black triangle? Did you see anything close up? Did you see something that you could classify as a classic flying saucer, things that the public has never seen? Luis, Alex, absolutely. I'm not going to go further than that. Absolutely, that is the reason why I'm so compelled to do what I'm doing. I know what I've seen. I know what others have seen as well. And that's why Congress people go into the briefings and they're kind of like, I'm going to take the briefing. And then they come out saying, holy cow, we got to get this stuff seriously. They're not looking at grainy photos of the Nimitz crews. They're looking at data and information that is classified, that goes to a much greater degree of fidelity that allows them to make decisions. By the way, at a unanimous level, they've all come out saying, holy smokes, we need to look into this. You have a task force that is established under no person other than the Deputy of Secretary of Defense. It goes further than that, where Bigelow talks about a case where they bring somebody on and the guy tells them about the crash. They were on the ship, the Nimitz. And he talks about how the ship came out of the water and goes beyond. Now, that should have been classified, but because they were able to bring him onto the briefing, they were able to get that information. Again, Bigelow. There's an attempt to destroy and bury the project. Let's play this. This might have to be the last clip. Based on religious factors in our government. Yes, religious leaders. Let's play the clip.
A little bit of this turf war, but there's also fear, gosh, if it gets out that we're studying this really weird stuff, we're going to be embarrassed. And as well as some religious folks who thought you were opening up the doors to hell or something like that.
Well, on the last year of funding, somebody got into the money that was supposed to come to us, and they took it. And that was the cause of why it wasn't funded the third year, is that the money went south to another place, another department. But within the agency was a religious peculiarity, a predisposition based on religion that scared a number of people in the agency, perhaps even outside the agency, that wound up dominating the thinking. And
let's stop there in the video.
This was based on
basically they're trying to bury this due to a religious faction that is terrified of what this subject is. Not that they disbelieve the subject, but more so they're terrified of it. Just like, if you put your head under the cover for a bear, the bear can't eat you. It's that. And the project itself, they're trying to put it back in the hole by undercutting and cutting away the funding and everything else for the program. It's utterly astonishing. This was Bob Bigelow. Like I said, the guy. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Everything you just heard is perfectly true. We'll be back in a moment.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for the last hour this morning and one of the last hours this week of the most disruptive show covering news, events, politics, and more from all sides of different political aisles and from across our country, as well as across the surface of our divided globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's get into the headlines. First up in COVID news, there have been at least 3,252 new coronavirus deaths and over 94,000, almost 95,000 new cases reported in the United States yesterday. That's the fourth day in a row. It's the fourth day straight in which the number of new cases from COVID has been under 100,000. The first week that this has happened since October, in which on any one day you had less than 100,000 new cases. Now, again, if you compare this to last summer, we're doing worse than we were then, and things seemed pretty bad with everything under lockdown. There's also the conversation which we've been having about whether the new strains that are circulating are going to cause the rate of COVID infections and subsequently the deaths to go up, even though you have the vaccine release. We'll see about that a little bit later, but I just pointing that out again. I want to keep a tab on that. Over the past week, there's been an average of 104,554 cases per day. That's a decrease of 36% from the average 2 weeks earlier. And as of this morning, more than 27,328,000 people in the U.S. have been infected with the coronavirus. Over 471,000 have died from it. Another way to look at this, anytime you have over 3,000 deaths a day, that's like another 9/11. Overall, and basically a month straight of 9/11s every day on average from this disease. Crazy increase in mortality. And again, a bunch of different causes for why we're here. But I would say one of them is that we did not respond in the early stages of this virus, developing, researching, manufacturing the vaccines nearly as effectively as we could have done more on shutting down our borders. Admittedly, Trump was getting pushback on that from Democrats all over the place. And at the same time, he was saying some racist stuff, calling this the Wuhan virus and the China flu, all that. But I did just different ways in which we could have been better protected. Or more PPE. Let's not leave that one out. If we'd had more personal protective equipment from early on, if instead of relying on global supply chains that almost inevitably contract as you have to close down borders and shipping lanes and all this stuff, well, that's kind of foreseeable. Anyway, I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but because we have been over this one, but still, worth saying again, both in retrospect and looking forward to other pandemics potentially coming in the future, almost certainly coming in the future. In other COVID news, the Cuomo administration, that's New York's Governor Andrew Cuomo, has set up 19 COVID-only nursing homes throughout the state to treat recovering patients who are discharged from hospitals too little, too late. This is after, of course, a couple of weeks ago, New York's Attorney General Letitia James came out with a report that showed that the total number of coronavirus deaths from nursing home residents had been undercounted and was actually 50% higher than had been disclosed at the time. Andrew Cuomo, by the way, has still not apologized. He's not taken responsibility for that. This is after he was lauded as a leading Democrat responder to the coronavirus crisis last summer. That does not look particularly good at this time. Governor Andrew Cuomo and his health department came under fierce criticism last spring before he got lauded as New York State, New York City became the epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic. Some nursing home operators claimed a March 25th state health department directive pressured them to admit or readmit COVID-19 patients at a time when they were already overwhelmed by the outbreak. At the time, nursing homes were not allowed to test new admissions for COVID-19, had inadequate personal protective equipment, and suffered from staffing shortages. In Los Angeles, Mayor Eric Garcetti said the city's 5 city-run vaccination sites, including Dodger Stadium, will close this weekend, Friday and Saturday, due to a lack of doses. The city will have exhausted its current supply of the Moderna vaccine for first dose appointments by today, forcing the temporary closures. The city has administered 293,000 doses so far at its 5 vaccination sites. That's a 27% distribution increase since last week, and it's averaging about 13,000 doses a day. Dodger Stadium, one of the largest mass vaccination sites in the country, has the capacity to inoculate up to 12,000 people a day on its own. The city, however, only received 16,000 new doses this week, down from 90,000 the week before and 29,000 from the week before that. Meanwhile, the United States will turn away most migrants apprehended at its border with Mexico under a Trump-era policy. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said this yesterday, adding that the move would limit the spread of the COVID pandemic and also give the new administration ample time to implement new migration policies. Although President Joe Biden vowed to undo Trump's border rules, he still has in place a provision called Title 42, which allows Americans' authorities to rapidly expel people crossing the U.S.-Mexico borders. So, hey, Jamarl, let's talk about this one for a second. Biden, as one of his big campaign promises, comes in and promises to immediately undo Trump's ruling on immigration. Now, he gets pushback from Texas judge, preventing him from doing that in the state. Anyway, skip forward a couple of weeks to today. They're not doing it. They're still pushing them out. I mean, you can debate. I was just talking about border closures. You can debate whether or not it's warranted. You can talk about different aspects of this, but isn't this another case of Biden making a promise like those $2,000 checks he promised right after the Georgia elections were won, never came? Isn't this another case of him making a promise and then walking back on it just a few weeks later?
That's exactly what it is. Yeah, it's a betrayal. I mean, look, from the standpoint of, at least the way I frame it, I think there's certain things that a politician can lie about and get away with, and there's certain things that they can't. Some of that has to do with just, the majority of opinion and everything else, and when it's competing against other people. The problem that Joe Biden has is that no Democrat had ever won Georgia in a runoff. And these 2 Democrats won it. Now, Warnock and Ossoff were very clear. You will get $2,000 if I go into office. Joe Biden said the same thing. You'll get $2,000. And then what happens? He gets in office and the check goes to $1,400. And Democrats have to explain mathematics of, well, there's 14 and there's $600 that Trump gave you. You said 2,000. Where are you getting 1,400 from? And so now they have to explain that, right? Ossoff is not backing away from it. Warnock is not backing away from it because what they realize is that they're going to lose their seat if they go this route. Because Republicans are the ones that had to put them in office either by voting for them or not voting for them for that money. And if you breach that, they will lose Georgia and they will lose the Senate in 2 years. I mark my words, they will do it. And so now you have another environmental immigration thing. Is that going to make gains in Georgia? Not really, but it definitely does speak to some degree of another backpedal. So it's like, you can only get so many of these before there's consequences. The Republicans have multiple people to vote for. It's not like they have nowhere else to go. They can vote for the Republican or they can vote for the Democrat. There's no skin off their back, either one. It's just for that, thing in their heads. It's a different conversation for people who are on the left, where they are materially hurt by a Republican getting in office, either from issues of race or issues of class. That's not true for Republicans. Meaning, if Biden keeps doing this, and he does this enough, he will lose the House. He will lose the Senate. He will lose the Senate. Now, me, was the one that said Democrats were going to keep the House, take the Senate, and could win the presidency. That is what happened. I am now saying that if Biden does not live up to it, he will lose the Senate. In fact, your dad was on TV that night when the election was taking place. Him and I were on, and I told him that was going to happen. And your dad said, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't see how that's going to happen. But I was right. Your dad would be on later.
Well, you can talk to him about it in just a few minutes. You can talk to him if you want to. You can come back. We've had him on a few times since then, so it's a little bit late to make that a bone of contention, but it was at the time. And you ended up being right. It was surprising. We'll come back to Georgia, the call between Trump and the Secretary of State there. This is, of course, part of the pushback against alleged election fraud that Trump made his big deal. And of course, that's at the center of what happened on January 6th. Speaking of which, let's get to national political news. House impeachment managers will today finish arguing their case that former President Donald Trump incited insurrection 1 day after they showed violent and disturbing video footage of the attack on the U.S. Capitol as they urged senators to convict at the Senate trial. Never before seen Capitol security camera footage forced senators to relive the harrowing attack and confront chilling new details about the serious threat posed to everyone in the Capitol, including lawmakers. A number of GOP senators made clear Wednesday evening that they were shaken by what they saw, but still signaled they won't change how they plan to vote as Trump appears headed towards acquittal at the conclusion of the trial due to not enough Republicans breaking ranks in order to actually impeach him. And just by the way, I think this is worth pointing out, Trump is the first president to be impeached twice. So just another little history-making moment there. Of course, more complicated because he's no longer the president, which of course has itself become a big issue constitutionally, whether you're able to do that. But they're doing it. A man fatally shot himself in front of the home of Texas Congresswoman Republican Rep. Beth Van Duyne's home on Wednesday afternoon, shortly before 4 p.m. When police officers arrived, they found the victim lying on the sidewalk with a gunshot wound. The victim's identity has not been released. Van Duyne, the former mayor of Irving, Texas, who was recently elected to serve in the House, was home during the shooting. She called the police after hearing a gunshot and seeing a body in front of her walkway. In international news, Pakistan's military on Thursday successfully test-fired a short-range surface-to-surface ballistic missile capable of hitting land and sea targets with high precision up to 280 miles away. That's 490 kilometers away. In a statement, it said the cruise missile was launched from a state-of-the-art multi-tube missile launch vehicle. According to the statement, Pakistan's president and prime minister and the country's military leadership congratulated scientists and engineers over the successful launch of the missile. 3 Turkish soldiers were killed in a new Turkish military offensive against Kurdish militants in northern Iraq, Turkey's defense ministry said Thursday. 2 of the soldiers were killed Wednesday in a clash that erupted in northern Iraq's Gara region on the first day of the latest Turkish operation. Another soldier died of his wounds on Thursday, today. Iran has started producing uranium metal despite being warned by world leaders that it constitutes another breach of the 2015 nuclear deal, which of course the United States pulled back from, so it's not that simple. Iran says it is carrying out research and development with the aim of producing fuel for a research reactor and insists that its nuclear program is entirely peaceful. However, Iran has also warned recently that it would respond like a cornered cat and would seek out nuclear armaments if it faced continued and harsher pressure from the United States and other Western powers. Iran's paramilitary Revolutionary Guard Thursday began a ground forces drill near the Iraqi border. The drill is dubbed Great Prophet. It's ongoing in the southwest of the country and has aimed at readiness and assessment of their forces. Drones and helicopters will be used in the drill too.
Can we just interrupt that for 1 second? Just to be very clear, the United States put a bullet in the JCPOA when Donald Trump took office. Iran stayed with it for a year, literally. Still, despite the fact that the U.S. put back on the sanctions, despite the belligerence and everything else, the EU, as opposed to going after the U.S. and backing up Iran in this, attacked Iran, saying, how dare you, and you better not move from it, despite the fact that the U.S. has already put a bullet in it. The language that they use is so deceptive in talking about these things. Unless it starts there, that the United States pulled away from the agreement, everything else that Iran does after the fact is irrelevant. The agreement was destroyed by the U.S. And by the way, they were using fantastic politics in order to, because their argument was, we're stepping back and we're pulling back a little bit, but we're staying with the agreement. Because they were still trying to argue in the context of the agreement with their position of political legitimacy, whereas the U.S. is being belligerent. Also, they were fighting on this notion of brinksmanship. Neither party wanted a war, so each party were willing to go up to the line in order to, this kind of tit for tat between the two powers. The politics of this was phenomenal and amazing. But let's just be very clear. The U.S. destroyed the JCPOA. It wasn't Iran.
It's true. It's true. I mean, this is after years of sanctions, after we overthrew their leader. The long history there. I'll be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of Iran's theocracy. I don't like theocracies in general, but that doesn't justify the foreign policy stuff. It doesn't make it any better. And it's, of course, just an extension of our larger geopolitical campaign in the region, which costs Americans money, kills a lot of Americans, and more importantly, in my opinion, at least by the numbers, kills millions of people in the region and sets us up for some potentially more serious, if that can be imagined, much more deadly conflicts if we decide to push this into a hot war. Right now it's assassinations and sanctions, and I'm worried about all-out war. But I do not think that we're going to be there anytime soon. But we'll see. Just based on recent guests of ours, they're guessing that we will hold back on that and just try to keep up the pressure campaign in various ways. But of course, Iran will keep their nuclear program going. So it's a case of escalation in some ways on both sides, and I'm worried about the fallout from that. But we'll see. I'm actually going to wrap it there. Those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're going into a break. When we're back, we're going to be joined by Lee Stranahan, host of Sputnik's The Backstory, talking about the impeachment trial, what's been going on in Georgia with the lingering legacy of the call between Trump and Georgia Secretary of State. As Georgia Secretary of State, his administration is now filing suit, is now preparing to file suit against Donald Trump over how that call went down. We'll be listening to audio from that call on the other side. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, when I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get into a conversation. The impeachment trial of Donald Trump continues this week, as yesterday House managers gave testimony on the breach of the Capitol building on January 6th, playing videos of Donald Trump's speeches in the months before and the day of the events, as well as playing new videos of those events taken from security cameras in the Capitol building. The conversation about this, how the impeachment process is going, what he thinks about it, where it'll take the Republican Party and our country. We are joined by Lee Stranahan, Sputnik News analyst and host of The Backstory. That show airs Monday through Friday on Radio Sputnik from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. Lee, thank you for joining us. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you for being with us. All right, let's get into this conversation. I've got some clips to play here. I'm going to get to those in just a minute, but I want to set us up for the conversation. Jamarl and I have been arguing back and forth over this with both between ourselves and with guests and with callers. I don't think the Senate is justified in impeaching Trump. It's not going to happen. By all appearances right now, there aren't enough Republicans breaking ranks. But frankly, I don't think they should, regardless, even the politics of it aside. I don't think that what he did or said the day of the events constitutes an impeachable offense, although it's ridiculous, and I think it buried him even further politically. Jamarl disagrees. We've gone back and forth on this. I just want to start us off. What's your take on what's happening?
Well, so first off, I agree with you for what that's worth. I think if they tried to censure Donald Trump, they would have gotten that, basically. I think a lot of people could have agreed with, for instance, a censure. But for a variety of reasons, including the fact that he's out of office and that one of the main purposes of impeachment is to remove someone from office. Let's just go over that, right? That's why you impeach somebody, is to remove them from office. The fact is that it's a show trial, and it's a show trial without the votes either. As you point out, whatever you think about it, it's not going to happen. And it's not just that you're not going to get a bunch of Republicans not voting for this. A lot of the Republicans, I think the number is 45, don't agree that this is constitutional. So let's just stop there for a second. You've got nearly half the Senate, a significant number of senators arguing that this is not even constitutional for the reasons we said earlier, which is, again, part of the purpose is to remove people from office. So at that point, to me, it's a kangaroo court show trial. But I think that is the point. And I think the whole point on this is, I referred to it sort of as a hamburger helper for Trump. It allows you to extend the Trump presidency by a few months here. It allows you to continue to bash Trump, because at the end of the day, if they're not bashing Trump, they don't have anything to say. I noticed this yesterday. There's a reason the news cycle is so quiet, is because whatever Biden's doing, you don't have the constant. With Donald Trump, if he got up in the morning and sneezed, the media attacked him for it. It was constant 24/7 warfare against Trump. Whatever you think about Biden, that doesn't exist anymore. And so things have gotten very quiet, because that's the sound of not the lack of constant screaming. And this impeachment, and by the way, I would argue that this thing in Georgia as well, that's just a way to extend it months, because it's a legal process. It's not going to be over quickly. And it's not going to go anywhere like this impeachment. It's not going to go anywhere. But, and I would argue, in fact, that the president may be making, a friend of mine pointed this out, the president may be making a mistake by participating at all. What would be the difference if you didn't even send lawyers, didn't even offer any defense, just go, I'm not playing this. You've got half the Senate who says this isn't constitutional. I'm not joining in your reindeer games.
I wouldn't characterize it that way. Now, and to be fair, I agree with you. On some level, it is theatrics. On some level, they've, lost their favorite whipping boy. And in doing so, they probably don't know what to do with themselves at this moment. So, agreed. I disagree, however, that the impeachment is not necessary. Even in your own words, you say one of the main purposes of impeachment is to remove a president, and the president is already gone. One of the main purposes implies that there are multiple purposes for impeachment. And one of those is to create a demarcation point in the public consciousness and even in the legal aspect, saying this is not something we can allow. A putsch attempt against the U.S. government. We allow all sorts presidents do all sorts of horrible things. They can fleece the public. They can play in this gamesmanship where they murder people abroad, assassinations, all that stuff. We allow it. Wide berth. We even allow all sorts of corruption, swamp monsters, the works. But you can't turn over the game board when you lose. And that's the issue for me. It's that the players of this particular game, as bad and as corrupt as this game is, when Donald Trump won it, he was perfectly willing to take the power of the presidency and do whatever he had to do. When Donald Trump lost it, in bad faith, because at a certain point, Donald Trump had nothing to back up his point of view. When all of his all lawsuits were exhausted, when all of the investigations came to bupkis, he still was out there screaming that he won in a landslide to 30 million people. It was infinitely foreseeable that many of those people, or some of those people, were going to have extremely reactive to that, whether they believed them or not. You have some people who believed them full hog and thought, oh my God, they're toppling democracy. We need to fight for the government of the United States. We need to fix democracy itself. That justifies all sorts of behavior. My point is that what Donald Trump was doing was infinitely foreseeable that was going to cause this level of chaos and this level of havoc. And that is not something that we can allow and abide in the political space for a president. You can't throw over the table and just try to take it all when you fail. And he was doing this stuff in the open. So I don't agree with this notion that it's entirely theatrics, even though on some level you're right, it is theatrics. And whether they have the votes or not is almost secondary to the point that this should be something that we are against. And because we've so weirded out in how horrible our political leaders act and the corruption on both sides of the political space, that I think we've become so deadened that we don't recognize something that should be impeachable. Also, the thing in Georgia is not for show. I mean, this person is actually opening a criminal investigation for serious. On particular note, Mrs. Willis' letter over the wider scope of the investigation, potential violations of state law, including the solicitation of election fraud, the making of false statements to state or local leader governmental bodies, conspiracy, racketeering, violation of oath of office, and any involvement in violence or threats associated with the election administration. He is on tape, Lee. He's on tape. That is problematic. Now, I know you disagree with what I just said, but certainly there is political or there's criminal liability here. His own lawyers told him he had opened himself for criminal liability. So it can't just be me. It is his own team that recognizes that Trump stepped in it. What do you think? Push back on me on this one. What did they get wrong?
Well, first off, you were completely wrong about what impeachment's about. You stated something that you just made up. You said the purpose is not, because I said the purpose is not just removal. I said something along those lines. You said
one of the main purposes of impeachment is removal of a president, and the president is already gone. And I'm making the point that may be one, but that is not the only. It is a political instrument.
Right. And then your argument from there was that because I said it's one of the purposes, that implies that there are other purposes. But just saying that there are other purposes does not imply that the other purpose is just something you can make up. I could not go from there and say there's other purposes. The other purpose, I'll be very specific, is disqualification from running for office again. Because the law on this, the Constitution, is actually very clear, and it enumerates very tightly what the penalties are. One of them is removal from office. The other one is disqualification from running in the future.
Lee,
from
I accept
office.
that as the literal, let's say, legal aspect of it. I'm talking about the overarching objective and the point. Yes, that's the legal thing, but when they're doing this, there's also a political reality to this. And the political reality is we don't want this behavior repeated. I mean, that's not wrong. You can say that. I'm not talking about this in a very strict legal sense. I'm talking about this from the standpoint of the point of the entire thing, of all of this.
Well, since this is a legal process, I'm going to talk about it from a legal sense.
But it's not just a legal process. It's also political.
Right. That's the way. Okay, that's fine. But it's legal. Therefore, just because something's political doesn't mean you can bring something. Yes, when we're talking about whether something is constitutional or not, there's a test you need to make. And whether it's political or not has nothing to do with that test. That test does it follow what the Constitution says? And as I say, about half the Senate, 45 people, don't think that it's constitutional in any way. And I don't see the argument that it is.
But a majority does.
Well, it doesn't make any difference.
No. I'm just saying 45 is less than 51. And more importantly, it is a point of view, right? You're arguing that from one point of view, they don't think it's constitutional. I'm making the point that the other point of view is that it is constitutional. And whether or not you think it is or not, it is taking place right now in physical matter reality.
Right. And what I'm saying is, first off, ultimately the constitutionality is going to have to be determined by the Supreme Court. But just bringing up that there's a political purpose doesn't change the fact that it is a legal process, and that if the goal is not to do what you're talking about, because if it was, that's like I say, a censure would do that. If you wanted to make a political point, for instance, you could do that with a censure, and you would get large agreement. I don't know how many of the 45 would have agreed with the censure, but I'll bet it's a significant number, and that would have passed. There's a reason they didn't do that. The Democrats, it's not that they're ignorant of the law. They're not. They're fully informed about the way the law and the Constitution work. They don't care. This is a show trial, period. That's all it is. Now, even on the face of it, this is a very dangerous threat to freedom of speech, because opening up wide the definition of what constitutes incitement is dangerous. There is a political price and a societal price to be paid for the idea that speech can be criminalized, which is what you're talking about. whether you agree with Donald Trump or whether I agree with Donald Trump, does Donald Trump have the right to believe? And it's not just out, but even with no reason, does he have the right to believe that this election was stolen from him? Does he have the right to say that he thinks the election was stolen from him? Now, again, even if he's wrong, even if he doesn't, I'm not even going to make the argument for it. Does he have the right to think that? Because tens of millions of Americans think that there is something very wrong with this election. So the question is, does the president have the right to think that and to say it? He didn't say anything that would constitute incitement to enter the Capitol or anything like that. He literally, nobody's pointed out anything that he said where he said, and again, there's a very high standard for this legally, as there should be.
This puts me in mind. Wait, Lee, let's bring you back because I want you to be able to get your statement on. It puts me in mind a little bit of Dick Cheney, where Dick Cheney would talk to, be a secret advisor to the New York Times when they would do a story on weapons of mass destruction, and then Dick Cheney would reference the article when he was the secret person on weapons of mass destruction to make his point about weapons of mass destruction. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. The voice that is pushing back on me pretty strongly is Lee Stranahan. Lee Stranahan is Sputnik news analyst and host of The Backstory, airing Monday through Friday on Radio Sputnik from 4 to 6 Eastern. We will be back in a moment with the Fault Lines, Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We've been in a pretty good back and forth on this whole thing of impeachment and whether or not this impeachment is constitutional or whether or not the impeachment should go forward at all as opposed to somewhat of a censure. And Lee is pushing back on me against this. Lee Stranahan is Sputnik news analyst and host of The Backstory, airing Monday through Friday on Radio Sputnik from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. Let me say this. When Hillary
Wait, Jamal, let me just push back on one other thing here.
Go for it.
I'm the co-host of The Backstory along with John Kiriakou.
Thank you.
Sorry, just a need to.
By the way, we had Kiriakou on yesterday. Kiriakou is awesome, man. Yeah, I mean, you guys should really listen to this. Listen to Lee's show. Both of these guys are really good, and Kiriakou particularly, great guy, affable, and the stories that he tells are phenomenal. So you two have an amazing show. So you're right. This is, and that again, that is Backstory, airing Monday through Friday on Radio Sputnik from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. If Hillary Clinton, when she was being investigated, and it came a point where they said Hillary Clinton should have known, regardless of what she thought, she should have known that her data was sensitive and that data should have been dealt with in a way that wasn't basically protected. That in and of itself should have been criminal because she should have known. When we get to the issue of Trump, the issue is not the speech that Trump gave. That underplays it on some level. The issue is that on day one, he comes out screaming that the election is fraudulent. We had no issue with that. I had no issue with that. We backed him up on that, saying, look, he needs to be able to look at the elections. The transparency is an issue. And I have no issue with the president going through lawsuits and trying to figure out what's true, what's false. We backed him up for weeks on that. But the problem that I come to is that at the moment where all of it goes bust, at the moment where his own lawyer is telling him to stop and to shut up, when you have various people like Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani representing Trump, basically telling him that the Cubans and the communists were working with Governor Kent to undermine Trump so Joe Biden can win, then at that point, you've lost me. Because the reality of it is gone out the window. And I can't believe at all that Donald Trump believed that he had won that race by a landslide, let alone won it at all. And even if he did believe it, I don't care at that point because there was nothing there for him to believe it. It's an issue of faith. Did Donald Trump have a good faith belief that the election was stolen? And if he did not have a good faith belief, and he is still stoking the crowd, it's still stolen, stop to steal, they're overturning America, then yeah, I have problems with that. And I think that is dramatically problematic because it is infinitely foreseeable what was going to take place. Lee, come on. If you're telling a crowd of millions that democracy has basically been undermined, that the country has been taken, that the election was stolen, what effect do you think that has? That effect was foreseeable. We called it on the show months in advance before that Capitol attack took place. That's my issue with this. That's why I have such trouble with this one. I wasn't for the other impeachments at all. I said it was nonsense. And even this, I accept on some level it's a show trial. But on a deeper level, it is necessary. If they would have impeached George Bush after 9/11, I have a hard time believing that Obama would have behaved in the way that Obama behaved, as cavalier as he was engaging in the 500,000 dead in Syria, or for that matter, the slave trades that ended up in Libya. So that's my issue with this. Please, tell me again why
what you're saying is extremely dangerous to free speech. Whether your opinion or anybody's opinion of what Donald Trump thinks, and by the way, again, his opinion is shared by tens of millions of people. There are a lot of people, and there are people on the left who have real questions about the election.
Yeah, because Donald Trump was screaming that it was stolen. That's why.
And that's his right. His right under our Constitution and under the First Amendment, and thank God for it, is that he believes, and again, there's reason for it, and he actually, you're at cross purposes with yourself here, in a sense, because the Georgia call, what you're arguing ultimately is that you think he was wrong. And what I'm saying is, when you're in an era when, and I was down, and Shane was there too. Shane remembers, we went down to a park in Virginia about 3 years ago because there was a shooting. It was right down the street from where Shane and I were living. And Shane, you remember this. We went down there,
yes,
and congressmen had been shot at practicing softball on a field there. We were about 3 feet away from Jeff Flake and other people who'd just been shot at by this guy. Now, why
you're talking Steve Scalise? Just to be clear, you're talking about the shooting of Steve Scalise.
The Steve Scalise shooting, yeah. And Flake, if you remember, we saw Flake.
I remember.
We saw a few other people. And we were some of the first reporters on the scene there just because we happened to live close by. And that was a guy who was a Sanders supporter. Now, if one wants to argue that the Sanders rhetoric and the Democrat rhetoric against Trump and against the Republicans, and this was a guy, it's not just that he was a Sanders supporter. He said he was doing the shooting to protect Medicare for all. That's what he said. And you can't use that as a standard to convict somebody or to shut down speech. So whatever anybody's opinion is on Medicare for all, short of somebody saying to him, go down and shoot people at a softball field, it's not incitement. And so if you don't agree with Trump's point of view, and I didn't agree with it, and there's a whole host of things. I didn't agree with Sidney Powell, but the beauty is that I don't want to get shot, or I don't want to get my speech shut down because I don't agree with Trump. The beautiful thing, Jamal, is that you have a right to disagree with Trump. But in the same way, you cannot take away, and this is exactly what the Democrats are trying to do. They are trying to demagogue away people's freedom of speech. And the phone call in Georgia, if your argument there seems to be that because they're prosecuting him, it's justified and righteous. Well, then the prosecution of Julian Assange is valid because they've prosecuted him.
That's not my argument.
Well, let's get into that.
Yeah,
no, let's get into
that's
that.
a straw man. That's not my argument. My argument is that Trump opened himself to prosecution by basically making that phone call and trying to threaten that guy and try to get that guy to do something that A, was illegal, and B,
well, we have that phone call
exists.
here. We have that phone call. Let's play that phone call. Andre, I want to get into the conversation about free speech, but while we're talking about this, Andre, let's play this clip from the conversation between Trump and Georgia's Secretary of State. Let's play this clip.
You know what they did, and you're not reporting it. That's a criminal offense, and you can't let that happen. That's a big risk to you and to Ryan, your lawyers. That's a big risk. But they are shredding ballots, in my opinion, based on what I've heard, and they are removing machinery, and they're moving it as fast as they can, both of which are criminal fines, and you can't let it happen, and you are letting it happen. I'm notifying you that you're letting it happen. So, look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the.
That last part, I know that's a bit of a longer clip, but I wanted to include that last part because he's not only talking about a criminal offense, he is asking them to find votes, and I'm sure that a lot of attention in the investigation is going to be put on exactly that ask from Donald Trump. I mean, here's the thing. I'm not sure how this is going to go. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know the case law on this stuff, but of that entire call, that's the part that sticks out to me. He's asking them to find the votes. Now, what's your take on that, Lee? Is that criminal? I'm guessing your take is not, but what do you think?
I don't think it's criminal. I think it's Trump being Trump. I think this is very similar to the Ukrainian impeachment, in which the way Donald Trump talks, which is not legalistic and is sloppy and blunt and everything else, Trump, that's why I say Trump being Trump. I don't actually think you quoted him right, and I could be wrong. But if we listen to that again, I think he said, I want to find, I think that's what he said. I think he said, I want to find, right? Now, the difference is semantic. It's minor, but it's not that, we're talking about semantics here. What did he say? I don't think that he, in his capacity as a government official, whatever he said on the call, what did he do? Did he sign an order? Did he do something like that? Because that's where, to me, it would get into a real criminal matter. Otherwise, the guy talking the way he talks, this is where, and again, if I were Trump's attorney, of course, I would never want Trump to talk. But I also never would have gotten Trump elected if I'd been his attorney. The reason people like Trump is because he doesn't talk like a lawyer. A guy like Obama is very good at slowing himself down and parsing, and Bill Clinton, the best parser in the world. Lawyers are very good at parsing things. Trump is like a bull in a china shop, but they know that, in fact, what came of this phone call? Did he then order something or order someone fired? Or no, nothing like that happened. It's just Trump spitballing, and he does have a lot of spit when he balls.
It's not the issue of him spitballing.
And here's I want to.
Oh, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
I want to come back to this briefly. No, you're good. I'll hand it to you, Jamal. But I just want to come back. I just looked up the transcript. You're right. He said, "quote I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have because we won the state." End quote. So he's not asking them to find it. He's saying, "I just want to find it." Again, that's semantics, but like you're saying, that's the whole point of this. You're trying to interpret somebody's speech. Jamal, you were going to come in. What were you going to say?
Yeah, I was going to say the issue is not Trump spitballing. I don't have an issue with the way Trump speaks. I have an issue with him trying to push people to do illegal things, trying to get Pence to go beyond his capabilities in regards to his responsibilities, trying to get Raffensperger, trying to get the Republicans to basically stand in. And again, whatever you want to think about this, it does matter whether or not reality matters, especially when it comes down to this notion of what Trump is trying to get people to do. Do you realize behind the scenes they were having fights about whether Trump was going to declare martial law, whether he was going to send the military down to take the voting machines in Georgia? I mean, this goes beyond just speech, Lee. I'm sorry. It goes beyond just speech. And so I understand your point and where you're coming from.
But you yourself are saying it. You're saying you don't like the idea that Trump was making an argument.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I have no issue with Trump making the argument. My issue is that there should be some legitimacy to the argument. I mean, come on. We're basically talking about a president that was doing all of these things that was in his power to try to get other people to do illegal things to keep himself in office. That's what we're talking about.
Legitimate argument should be able to make them.
It goes beyond
Is that
speech.
your argument? That only people that you determine have legitimate arguments? Just because you don't agree with Trump's point and you don't think it's legitimate, that he shouldn't be able to argue with anybody, including his vice president. I think he should be able to make, this is the whole point of free speech. The point of free speech is that Trump should be able to make his argument.
Lee,
now,
were the communists working with Hugo Chavez to undermine the electoral system of Joe Biden? I mean, to undermine Trump.
That is still within his rights. And we both made fun of that. And I think it's ridiculous. And it was a stupid argument to make. But Lee's right on this one. You should be able to make whatever freaking arguments you want to, because the moment that you give some higher authority the power to determine whether your argument is good or bad is the moment that you've lost the ability to make arguments at all. You've just ceded your ability to give anything that stands up to what the establishment would say. And that's a lot of what we try to do on this show, which is to push back on the establishment's stupid arguments and their stupid cases for doing things. We're out of time. We're going to continue this conversation, I'm sure, on the other side of this break in our wrap segment. But first, I want to thank Lee. Thank you for joining us for this conversation.
Sure. And let me just say, watch People versus Larry Flynt. Watch Edward Norton's speech to the Supreme Court in the film since Larry Flynt died. Watch it. It's one of the greatest scenes in the histories of motion picture about the First Amendment. And it's exactly about this point. His point was in that speech, I like the right for people to argue. And that's what I think is at stake here. Thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks, Ben.
Hey, thanks for being with us. That was the voice of Lee Stranahan, Sputnik News analyst and host of The Backstory. That show airs Monday through Friday on Radio Sputnik from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. By the way, you can follow Lee on Twitter at Stranahan and check out his channel on YouTube, populist.tv. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're taking calls when we come back from this break, 202-521-1320. Again, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines. Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we're back. Fast-paced conversations this morning. I like it. We're taking your calls. We're in our wrap segment. That means it's time for you to call in if you want to join the conversation. This is the last and the best, frankly, chance to join in the conversation. The number is 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. Let's go to Brave calling in from Atlanta. Brave, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Hey, good morning, guys. I'm really enjoying this show. First thing from the deal earlier talking about the Buffy show. Love that show. Also, nothing great comes without hardship to a certain extent when it comes to creativity. So I think that we spend a lot of time, looking back on things and then condemning just because it makes us feel better. But I mean, creativity typically comes from hardship, right? Some of our best artists have come from hardship and struggle and pain and stuff like that. To the argument about the impeachment, again, I'm gonna go and say that I agree with you, Shane. I agree with Lee. Jamal, you said that he was making a straw man argument, but you've been arguing a straw man argument this whole entire time.
Wait, how am I arguing a straw man argument? I made a point that he was saying straw man because he was undermining. Well, wait. I made that point because when Lee said it, he basically gave a caricature of what I was trying to say. And I've been full-throated in my argument, so you need to explain in specific detail what have you said that was a straw man and who I was straw manning in that straw man argument that you're trying to say I was making.
So here, fine. So this entire time you've been debating the legality of the impeachment and whether he should be or should not be, right? You're using examples that aren't based in fact. There's been no fact-finding mission. There's been no task force.
Stop. That's not what I was arguing. Lee was arguing the legitimacy or the legalities of it. That's not my argument. I'm arguing and I'm making a political argument. I've been very clear about it. So you still explain how I am strawmanning when I am making my argument about why Trump should be impeached. And who am I strawmanning if I'm strawmanning anybody at all? Please continue.
Brave. I don't mean to. Yeah, please do be clear on this one. I just want to. This is almost comic relief. This would be a straw man of a straw man of a straw man. If Brave, you're making an argument that Jamal wasn't making, but I don't. I want to hear from you. What do you think Jamal was doing here?
Let me get to my ultimate point, and I'll just bear it because I don't have the amount of time of a guest. Right? Here's my thing. There's not been any investigation in the so-called insurrection. There's not been any fact-finding mission into the insurrection other than journalists for either side or whatever side, biased or not, putting out their information. So there's a lot of information out there. What Lee was saying is very correct. There are many people, including myself, who believe that the election was fraudulent, and it's fraudulent every time we have elections. This is something that we all come to understand, but then seem to brush over in this instance, right? So if the idea is that Trump's argument has to be legitimate, or he's been impeachable, then what does that say, and how does that apply to the actual impeachment itself? If again there has been no fact-finding task force or anything like that, and then what about the whole Russiagate thing for 4 years, which can also be argued as an attempt at coup or delegitimizing of Trump's presidency, or even of delegitimate to make the election illegitimate. You see what I'm saying? So excuse me, I got caught in my own words there, but. I mean, this whole thing is a farce. The whole thing is a farce. And I'll close by saying this, Jamal. You say that we all, your point the other day when I called it was that we're all engaged, or we all agree to play this game, right, of democracy, this imaginary game of democracy, this illusion that we know is not true, right? But then at the same time, you're saying that Trump doesn't get to imagine that the election was stolen, or that the election was fraudulent, and I don't see how you rationalize that, because you know what I'm saying? Like this is all an illusion. They're not impeaching him for some kind of criminal act. This is free speech. It is. Right? So they're not impeaching him for going to war. They're not impeaching him for supporting Yemen, anything like that. They're impeaching him for their own reasons. This is not even a legal matter. So that's what I'm saying. We have to be very careful. As Lee said, we have to be very careful when we start being willing to make arguments because of one fool, and then we decide to cast away freedom of speech.
Now, Brave, just real quick, stay on the line for a moment. I listened to everything that you just said. I am still listening for where I was strawmanning somebody. That's the only thing I honestly care about in your dialogue right there. Where was I strawmanning somebody? Because that is somewhat of a slander to me, especially if you can't back up the point. So please explain where and who I strawmanned. Go there.
I'll tell you what I'm going to do. For the greater point, I'm going to retract that.
Right? Whoa! That's a big man of you. I appreciate that.
I don't have any problem. I'll retract it. Only because I don't want to get caught up on that. You just said you don't care about the rest of the argument. You only care about that.
Yeah, because you went after me saying I was strawmanning somebody, and I wanted to know who and where and at which point was I strawmanning somebody when I made my arguments. I've made multiple full-throated arguments. I haven't strawmanned anybody. I was very honest about my perspective.
I get it.
I wanted to just know where. Please,
he said a lot else. He said a lot else too, and that's the thing. When you said there's, that's the only thing you cared about. I think I understand where you're coming from.
I hope you do understand where I'm
under
coming
attack
from.
there. He was accusing you of a straw man. I get what you're saying. I get where that comes from. But he made a lot of other good points, and I would say the free speech one is
my
one
concern in this was the straw man part. That's the part that they care about. Because honestly, if you're basically saying that the argument that I was making is somehow spurless, or that it was somehow inelegant or dishonest in some way, or that I was characterizing, yeah, that's a big deal to me, especially if you can't back up and legitimize that particular point, right? Why shouldn't I be bothered by that? I am bothered by that. On a further point, I've made the point multiple times that Russiagate was them going after Trump for ridiculousness. So, yeah, I don't know what that has to do with the President of the United States trying to basically stay in office and undermine and get rid of this notion of representative government. As ossified, as broken, and as frail and feeble as our democracy is, yes, it's all those things. Those people are radically corrupt. That is also true. But the country would not have been made better if Donald Trump was able to get various Republicans or various people in these various positions to do the things that were illegal and beyond their boundaries to do. I don't think that would have been a better situation.
I mean, maybe. I don't know. That's the thing. That's a consequentialist argument. That's the kind of argument you were making. When you were talking about Buffy and Joss Whedon earlier in the show, which, by the way, great, funny to hear that you like that show. I hear it's good. I just haven't seen it yet. But coming back to the conversation here, I think the free speech argument is really the deeper one. And after Lee brought that up, that's kind of the new lens that I think I'm going to start putting on when I'm looking at this exact conversation, because that is the deeper issue. It's not the consequences for the impeachment process. It's not just the consequences for future presidents. It is what speech is protected. If even though he said to his protesters that they should march peacefully on Congress, if that's going to be declared incitement, then that feels Orwellian to me. I don't know what else to say. I disagree with the argument that he was making. It seems ridiculous to me. But I whether it's good faith or bad faith, whether it's a good argument or a bad argument, is irrelevant to the fact that he, like any American, should be able to make those arguments. And if you want to criticize it, it shouldn't be a legal response, because that erodes our legal liberties, our civil liberties, like the most fundamental of them, the first one codified in our amendment process, the most sacred of them. Then the way to do that isn't through impeachment. It isn't through a lawsuit. It's through, like Lee was saying, censure. It's through some formal repudiation of the process. But
that's fair.
We got another call.
Fortunately, that's not where my argument ever went. My argument never went to the notion of Donald Trump getting that speech, telling people go. My argument went to the notion of, for months, he stoked the audience with basically lies. He did his investigations. Why on earth would I go beyond the investigations that Donald Trump went? Why should I give him this uber benefit of the doubt on this stuff? He did the investigations. He spent his money to do those things. He came up with buckets, and he still came up with a certain decision and opinion. It's not the one individual speech. And I'm sorry, free speech doesn't apply. You can't get into a room and scream fire. There are limits to free speech. And Donald Trump basically did that to millions.
That argument doesn't pan out.
It does pan out, because he basically did that to millions of people by telling them that their election was stolen. It was infinitely foreseeable what was going to happen if you tell all the millions of people that they basically were cheated or their election was stolen. He knew he was doing what he was
doing. So does that mean that all elections from now on? Does that mean that all elections from now on are suddenly sacred? Does that when did he cross the line? Was it that his argument was bad and you thought it was ridiculous, or was it just that he was pushing back against it for all? Because I know where your answer is. You were pushing. You were saying our elections are a sham for months. You were also criticizing him when he brought forward the ridiculous argument. That's when you switched sides. But why is that? What kind of rubric is that? And which authority are you gonna trust to judge which arguments are good and which are bad? Wouldn't they use that power against you? Wouldn't they use that to shut down your speech because they disagree with either the content or the implications of the arguments you're making? Isn't that pretty much inevitable if you start giving that power away? And we got another caller, and I feel bad for.
Yeah. Well, I'll let that. Right. Let's go to the other caller. We can talk about it over the course of the week.
All right. Let's do it. Sorry for the wait here. Hope you understand. We got Stedman calling in from Detroit. Stedman, you're on. What's going on?
Hey, so this is really kind of sad because Jamal is actively being censored, basically for having his own ideas on his channel. Right. YouTube is even going through the process of checking out what the content of the video is. The fact that he's showing a video, and he's simultaneously to that actively working to censor someone else for the protected speech. I mean, so let's say with the straw man, the fire in the crowded movie theater is a straw man. The equivalent of this would be if Trump was advocating that someone was going to start a fire in a movie theater, and everybody he told went and killed a person because they thought that was the guy he was talking about. No. I mean, it's ridiculous to try to draw this parallel because elections are rigged in this country, which you have said about Bernie since 16 and in 20, and you don't see how this invalidates your own position.
No, it doesn't, because the elections for Sanders were clearly rigged. Clearly rigged. And so, you could literally see it. You could put your fingers on it. And everybody keeps screaming about this election being rigged, and none of you put your fingers on it. You haven't been able to show squat. You've just been saying it, and people have been asserting it. There's a very difference between that and being able to prove it. And Donald Trump, look, this is not a free speech issue. He knew he was lying about it. He went through with it anyway. So I feel you. This is a conversation we're going to be having over the course of the week. So I'll end it here.
Absolutely. And probably going into next week and for some time into the future. But here's the thing, Jamal. If Biden is of the DNC, he would probably think your arguments are ridiculous too. But does that mean that you shouldn't be allowed to make them? Who do 15 with these powers? I do not trust anybody else. That's why we have these rights. Anyway, we got to go into the end of our show today. Thank you everybody for listening, and thank you to our callers, guests, producers Cam and Raheem, staff, and thank you Jamal Thomas, my co-host, for hosting the show with me. And thank you for listening. We'll be back tomorrow, folks. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan signing off.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, another one in the record books. Guys, this is probably going to be put on my Rofkin account also. Yeah, this is probably going to be put on the Rofkin account also. I've started on there for obvious reasons, right? I haven't heard anything back from YouTube yet. The last thing I heard from them, they contacted me yesterday basically saying, hey, we're still looking into this matter and we will give you a heads up whenever we give you a heads up. Look, just to make a point about the Trump thing, my issue is not a free speech one. Donald Trump was president of the United States. Donald Trump could say whatever the hell Donald Trump wants and it'd get news. No, my issue goes deeper than that. It goes into this notion of governance in and of itself. Does Donald Trump have a right to say whatever the hell he wants? Yes, he does. When Donald Trump is president of the United States, he has a responsibility to defend the Constitution. Is he doing that when he's basically trying to get various people to commit illegal acts and overturn the Constitution? I would say no. He's not defending the Constitution like that. Did Donald Trump have a good faith belief that the election was stolen? In the beginning, maybe. Going in a month later, when everything else was expired, no. And yet he continued to push this idea that the election was stolen, the election was fraudulent. And if you're going to tell 30 million people that the election is fraudulent, that is no different than screaming fire into a crowded theater. In fact, it's even worse because you have this notion that people are willing to defend democracy by all counts. And so now you have 30 million people that believes that the country was basically stolen by Joe Biden and the communists. What are those people going to do? Honestly, what are they going to do? What are they compelled to do in that situation to defend democracy and to defend America? And is it foreseeable that those people are going to behave in ways that are somewhat belligerent and untoward? Even during the point where they were at the Capitol, even when they were raiding the Capitol, Donald Trump was egging these guys on, still telling them to stop to steal. Pence just need to do the right thing. Otherwise, Pence is being a pussy. Yeah, and it also goes to the behind-the-scenes stuff that he was trying to do to get those people to do illegal acts. I don't care if Donald Trump holds a position. I don't care if Donald Trump doesn't concede for the election. Donald Trump can get on Twitter all he wants. I had no issue with Donald Trump being on Twitter. I don't even believe they should have taken him off Twitter. I fought for Alex Jones. I didn't believe they should have taken Alex Jones off. But this goes beyond just the president and an individual talking. This goes into the notion of our country, this broken, fragile, corrupt system of governance to which we own, where we allow them to murder people abroad. We allow these guys to be war criminals, but there's something else that goes further into it when it's the game space itself where they're turning the table over. I lost. I just want to take it all now. Yes, I have issues with that. Great qualms and issues with that. I think that is a little bit different than YouTube being belligerent and shutting down speech that is legit, calling it harmful, spamming, or whatever else the fuck they want to call it. This is a president. This is an issue of whether or not this president was trying to overthrow the government of the United States. And from my perspective, based on the evidence that is at our disposal, from his own testimony, from his own tweets, from the behind the scenes between him and Pence, him and the other Republican senators, all that stuff is clear at this point. I think he's fucking guilty. Impeach the motherfucker. That's where I'm at. I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, I'm going to say subscribe, and you are going to hear great back and forths on this the entire way through. So I'm going to say, I'll see you guys in a few.